you everyone for coming today, and thank you already to all the speakers who will be delivering, I'm sure, very interesting and stimulating talks. The objectives really of today's interdisciplinary program is to foster a dialogue that I hope starts here today but continues, in which art history and the research into psychedelics and their use in the creative art will continue beyond today, fostering new research questions and dialogues between these disciplines. As you know, this day coincides with the current exhibition on Michaux's Mescaline Drawings at the Courtauld Gallery, which closes on the 4th of June. And if you haven't been, I highly recommend it, which is in Somerset House, and which really began thanks to the gift of one fantastic Michaux Mescaline drawing, which is at the center of the show, which entered our collection in 2020. And it was this really intriguing work that pushed us to consider organizing a display around that drawing, because in fact Michaux hadn't been the focus of a dedicated exhibition since the 1999 revelatory Whitechapel Gallery show. And so it sort of felt timely that a whole generation hadn't seen works by Michaux in London, but in this country as well. Michaux's being well represented on the continent, especially in Paris and France, but yeah, very little seen here, so it felt really was timely. And while researching Michaux's practice and his methodical approach to the use of psychedelics and mescaline in particular, I became intrigued and wanted to know more about the current research practice in this area, and especially the intersection between the scientific research into the use of psychedelics to cure mental illnesses and the fringes of that research that look at how this may benefit the creative act and in what ways. Just recently, the Sainsbury Centre of the University of East Anglia has organized a series of exhibitions around the theme of why do we take drugs. And Vanessa Tothill, who will speak later today, will tell us more about that exhibition and its outcomes. Proof that this subject continues to be of great interest, and really I'm hoping that, as I said, today's talks will sort of bring two worlds together that may often be separate, and in which research sort of goes along separate ways, and I hope that this will be the sort of start of more conversations and discussions among different disciplines. I will begin by introducing the first of our speakers, Oliver Davies, who is professor of French at University College Cork, a new recent appointment.
Since October, yeah, very recent.
And co-editor of the Frontiers in Psychology series in the Psychedelic Humanities. He has published on psychedelic self-experimentation by Henri Michaux and on the conceptualization of autonomy in psychedelically assisted psychotherapy, and has just completed a book on the political ramifications of the ongoing psychedelic renaissance. And in March 2024, he organized the first research day on the psychedelic humanities in Ireland, and is a member of the Drug Science Medical Psychedelics Working Group. And I'm really, very, very pleased that he's accepted to talk today, so the floor is yours. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you, Ketty, thanks. Good morning. So the 5 books at the top of the slide and the half-hour film just below issue from Henri Michaux's psychonautic self-experimentation with mescaline during the 1950s and 60s. And they've rightly been described by the drug historian Mike J., who will be seeing this afternoon and hearing on video. They've been described in his brilliant cultural history of mescaline as the century's most sustained and creative engagement with this particular psychedelic. Michaux also has more to say in his works about other psychoactive and psychedelic substances, including cannabis, psilocybin, and LSD, but his main focus and mine today will be on mescaline. So many of Michaux's contemporaries and subsequent critics have viewed his 10-year-ish involvement with psychedelic drugs with a mixture of regret, bafflement and disapproval. But the philosopher and critic Maurice Blanchot, commenting in 1958 on the first two of the 5 published by that point, declared them 2 great books. I'm going to read, so I'm just going to read the English translation of the French on the slides. So declared them to be 2 great books which, if literature still mattered to us seriously, should become the object of our intense meditation. As well as highly inventive literary drug writing, the first 3 of these books also contain dozens of reproductions of Michaux's Mescaline Drawings, and that's from Misérables Miracles to 2 facing pages. So I first wrote about Michaux's mescaline experiments in a long article published in 2023 in the context of wider collective endeavours to establish an emergent field of research that some of us want to call the psychedelic humanities. If you want to, you can easily find the article if you Google Oliver Davis, Henri Michaux. It's free to view. And in that article, I claim that Michaux deserves to be regarded as a kind of founding father, or grandfather, if you like, of Western psychedelic culture, and that his drug work that spans 3 media is far more extensive, texturally and cognitively rich, yet also for that reason far more difficult than Aldous Huxley's far better known foundational texts from a similar period. So I also show in the piece how accidents of translation were very largely responsible for Michaux's not being much more widely read in the psychedelic counterculture of the 1960s in America. And as Ketty mentioned, I've more recently been writing a book on the political dimensions of psychedelic experience. So I'm coming back really to Michaux's work today, having done that other book, and I'm going to try and talk a bit more than I do in the article on the visual dimensions appropriately, I hope. But I do want to start with the writing, and what I'm going to come to later on in the talk, after I've looked at the writing a little bit, I'm going to say something that I hope is a little bit provocative about how I think the Mescaline Drawings should be viewed as visual art and should not be viewed. Okay, so first then the Mescaline writing. So Michaux did sometimes try to write notes and draw sketches of his experience while actually high, but as any of you who've ever tried such a thing will know, this is not easily done. One gets distracted. And it's important to bear in mind as we look at and read the writing, and indeed the drawings, that both are retrospective reconstructions of his encounters with drugs. The other point I think it's important to underline at the outset, partly because this had a significant impact on the early reception of Michaux's work, and it particularly, I think, helps explain why the writings in English translation that there were in the 1960s were not more read and influential in the psychedelic counterculture in America in particular. So the second point that I want to underline is that initially his reaction to mescaline is extremely hostile, and actually this hostility never really disappears throughout, even though he does become more interested in what the drugs do. But there remains this kind of remnant of kind of irritability, and that's actually partly why I love his drug writing. So he says then, and you can see it already, in the title, Misérable Miracle, a miserable miracle. It's maybe a miracle, but it's an impoverished one, a miserable one. Mescaline diminishes the imagination. It castrates the image, desensualizes it. It makes images that are 100% pure laboratory grade. Thus, it is the enemy of poetry and meditation, and above all, of all mystery. So the mescaline experiences are initially then an unwelcome disruption to his settled habits of creative working. But by powering through the adversity of that disruption, and this is a process that I call in the article anthropotechnical practicing, drawn really from the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, so practicing against the gradient, the coefficient of adversity that the drug introduces, allows him to undertake a brilliant formal and textural aesthetic reconstitution of the pullulating profusion, the sense of sprouting and generative multiplicity, of chaotic creative potentiality, which characterizes his experience overall. Now, as you can see from these two facing pages of Misérables et Miracles, which are typical of the layout of the text in the first two books, what he produces is that most entrancing of literary objects, literally a double text. Not a text and subtext as we used to call it, but rather a main body and a second marginal text alongside in italics. Michaux commented in the preface to Misérables et Miracles that in this book, the margin occupied more by shortcuts than titles expresses very insufficiently the overlappings, les chevauchements, a phenomenon always present with Mescaline. No other devices have been used, too many would have been needed. So a double text is thereby erected, which is, as it were, doubled again by the inclusion of the drawings in the first three of the 5 books, and the writing and drawing are, again, doubled, if you like, by the filmic representation. So this doubling or multiplication, this proliferation of the text into text plus paratext, complicated in turn by the transmedial proliferation into drawings and film, can be understood as an attempt to go some way towards expressing formally, that's to say aesthetically, the pullulating multiplicity characteristic of Michaux's Mescaline experience, and the tendency for elements within that experience to overlap, influence, interact with and impinge upon each other. And in Michaux's case then to share that experience with his audience by way of a textual, graphic and filmic reconstruction that obliges them to read and see differently in their own aesthetic engagement with the works. So the iterative formal reduplication of the text can be understood as the expression in terms more of form than represented content of his experience of pullulating multiplicity under Mescaline. Pullulation everywhere, pullulation from which there is no exit, space full to overflowing, space of gestation, space of transformation, and multiplication, teeming space, which, even if it were only an illusion, would give a better account than ordinary sight of what the cosmos is. Michaux's work suggests then that psychedelics do not enhance creativity by simply increasing output within existing forms and frameworks, still less by providing in their visuals ready-made representations, images that can be transcribed onto paper or translated into text. Instead, psychedelics first dismantle those forms and frameworks. They disassemble the production line, so to speak, and de-automate the production. They thereby clear a space in which the subject can remake the tools, forms, and techniques of their practice. So when enhanced by psychedelics, creativity also involves destruction, stoppage, before, in the best of circumstances, as in Michaux's case, it leads to the generation of new forms and new habits. So Michaux's textual reconstruction of mescaline's effects often characterize the drug as an alien mechanism operating within him, as it were heteronomously. So he quickly realizes that this mechanism will work upon any material that he feeds it. And in other words, he quickly discovers that it heightens his capacity for self-suggestion, if you like. So this is the same page, double page, which I've marked up a little bit. So what's happening at the top of the page is he's looking at mountains, which he thinks of as immense mountains. And then what happens further down is that he's saying immense to himself in his head, as it were, and then the letters of the M's in immense fly up and become arches for unthinkably Baroque cathedrals. But then at the top of that last main paragraph on the left-hand page, assez, j'ai compris, enough, I get it. So he resolves then to try not to think of anything. Let's not give one idea, not one item to this crazy mechanism. But already the machine had begun again, moving off again at 100 images a minute. So on many different occasions, across the 5 Mescaline books, with many different stimulus materials, if you will, Michaux's textual reconstruction of psychedelic experience suggests that it offers an intense encounter with his own plasticity, by which I mean that it offers him, in other words, an insight into what it means to be both the shaper and the shaped as he moves his masculine mind in one direction and then seeks to pull it back in another. So what's reconstructed then in the text is by turns a delicate pas de deux and a fraught agonistic struggle between heteronomy and autonomy. So much so, actually, that elsewhere I've characterized psychedelic experience in general in terms of auto-heteronomy. Now, of course, a lot of the biomedical research today, and we'll be hearing more about that later, in the psychedelic renaissance is concerned with understanding and harnessing the power of psychedelics as psychoplastogens, in other words, ways of making the brain or mind more malleable and allowing it to free itself from the rigid constraining circuitry of addiction and other pathologies. In other words, to re-experience the plasticity and childlike curiosity of a young brain, or in neurocomputational terms, to loosen the hold of our brain's so-called hyperpriors. But from a philosophical point of view, and certainly from the perspective of the phenomenology of psychedelic experience, which is what concerns me most in the recent book on the political ramifications that I've just finished, so there's an infinite distance, phenomenologically, the distance of a turbulent infinity, if you will, between merely holding propositional knowledge that one is capable of self-shaping, one is plastic, and the intense experiencing of one's own plasticity under psychedelics. Such intense experience of my capacity for self-shaping and self-transformation is, I argue in the book, radically potentiating in a way that merely holding a belief, holding propositional knowledge about my being capable of self-shaping is not. And this, I surmise, is why the drugs can be so effective in treating depression, anxiety, addiction, and all sorts of other pathologies of unwanted stuckness. But something I want to underline about the drug writing, because it should, I think, have a huge bearing on how we view the Mescaline Drawings, is that Michaux could hardly have been more dismissive about the phenomenal content of the mescaline trip. In other words, about the so-called visuals that he sees while high on the drugs, and the visions or hallucinations, if you will, that they engender. Early on, these visuals are dismissed as a tacky retinal circus. And although he doesn't use the word, Michaux seems to be objecting in effect to what Clement Greenberg might have called their kitsch. They are, Michaux says, shockingly like advertisements. The garish colours, the insistence, their schematic quality, which detaches them from the realm of sensuous experience, makes them the enemy of poetry, to recall again Michaux's initial negative judgment in Misérables de Miracle. And even in the later books, as I've suggested, where he will report encounters with entities, being traversed by cosmic energies, this Sion that I think we'll talk about probably a bit later in the program, and even actually in L'Infini Turbulent, Turbulent Infinity, the second book, he has what looks like a full-blown religious mystical experience. He reports in block capitals, "I have seen the thousands of gods." But Maurice Blanchot, to come back to him, suggested very astutely, I think, that that's not a report that makes any of us stop what we're doing, gather around and pay attention. Indeed, even Michaux's admirers don't take it exactly at face value, indeed as anything other than a kind of heteronymous expression of the drug's power. But anyway, despite the more open and appreciative tenor with which he responds to later experiences, it's important not to forget he never abandons his relative disinterest in or disdain for the phenomenal content of the mescaline experience, so the so-called visuals or hallucinations, if you will. What he sees while high always remains far less significant, I would argue, than the phenomenology of his experiencing. In other words, it's watching his own mind under mescaline at work, which is his greatest pleasure. It's watching the experiencing, his own experiencing, and not watching what the experience involves watching that matters for him. So it follows from this that it would be very wrong-headed to see the Mescaline drawings as attempts to capture on paper Michaux's mescaline visuals. Rather, the drawings are attempts, I would argue, to reconstitute aesthetically the dance of autonomy and heteronomy that characterizes the phenomenology of psychedelic experience. And as we look at the drawings and lose ourselves in the astonishingly minute, delicate detail, we're not contemplating some cut and paste of mescaline visuals, but rather an aesthetic analogue of the psychedelic experience, of its phenomenology, as Mishaux grasped it, or in other words, of our own auto-heteronymous capacity to construe and relinquish pattern. We can move the focus of our attention up and down, up or down, left or right, or we can just remain still, immersed and contained in just one of these intricate little bubbles. And this is all so much clearer in the beautiful exhibition of drawings than it is, I think, in any of the reproductions. So as I return to my engagement, my earlier engagement with Michaux in preparation for today's study day, I realized how important his work had been in helping me to formulate what I believe is a decisive question in the wider field of psychedelic studies, particularly in attempts to understand the therapeutic value of psychedelics. And that could be summarized by this question. So when we're thinking about what's transformative about a transformative trip, is it the phenomenal content? Is it what I see, what I feel, what I hear, and so on? Or is it the phenomenological experience, the process of experiencing that matters? And in the book, I come down very firmly on the side of the second of those. That it's not actually what we see, hear, and feel. It's actually the phenomenological experience that matters most. And how we answer that question, what is transformative? Which of those two is transformative? It determines, I think, not only how we can envisage transformation, and that might be personal, but it might also be political and cultural, arising from psychedelic experience. But it also informs our understanding of the kinds of questions and worries and dangers and opportunities that we think matter within psychedelic studies and psychedelic science. So if we believe that the phenomenal content is the most important factor, that it, if you like, provides a kind of set of coordinates that we follow out of our maze of unwanted stuckness, then we are going to worry a lot about being misled. We're going to worry about apophenia, seeing pattern where there isn't pattern, conspiracism, false memories, and so forth. But I think actually we might also be asking questions, about the reality of the phenomena we see. So, do DMTLs exist? Is psychedelic experience evidence for panpsychism? All of those kinds of questions and worries are based on the first part of that alternative. But I think actually it's the second. It's the phenomenological experience that's important in psychedelic experience. So it's the intense appreciation that psychedelic experience affords of my plasticity, of my being plastic, by which I mean being both the object and the subject of my own remoulding, remaking, the shaper or artist of my own reinvention, and also simultaneously the material being reformed or reinvented. So the psychedelic trip, even a lengthy psychedelic trip under mescaline or LSD, for example, of many hours, is still a transitory and intense occurrence, experience, and it's sufficiently condensed to constitute a concentrated experience of my passing from one state into another, or through a series of states and out again into the everyday world. And provided that I've chosen to take the psychedelic, and that's obviously very important, and I know that I've taken the psychedelic, then however bizarre, mystical, unrealistic, if you will, the content of the experiences I then have are, I will retain some awareness, or if it's a really strong trip, a powerful trip, I will regain that awareness as I come out of it gradually, that all of this follows from my autonomous decision vis-a-vis the drug, in other words, to take the drug. My claim then is what matters in transformative trips is the experience of departure from everyday reality, passing through different states, and all of that consequent upon my own autonomous decision to take the drug in the first place. So if the psychedelic trip could offer us the intense experience of simultaneously being shaped and doing the shaping, then what we're effectively undergoing is an experience of what sociologists and political scientists in a different register call agency, of our being selves with the capacity to modify our own being, our lives, and the world around us. While we may be aware in a more diffuse sense that our choices shape our destiny, and we might think that autobiographical reflection can help us realize what prior choices we've made that have made us who we are and help us to change, actually the intense experience of this plasticity under psychedelics is altogether far more potentiating than that kind of longer durée contemplation. So under psychedelics we experience directly and intensely our own malleability to ourselves and to our environment, our being both shaper and shaped. And our aesthetic encounter with Michaux's Mescaline Drawings and drug writings can allow us to see all of this and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. That was really great. Fantastic. Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Nina Parish. Nina is Professor of French and Francophone Studies and Head of the Division of Literature and Languages at the University of Stirling. Much of her current research is in memory studies, with a focus on representations of difficult history, the migrant experience, and multilingualism in the museum. But she's also an expert on the interaction between text and image in the field of modern and contemporary French studies, and has published widely on this subject, and in particular on Henri Michaux. Nina will today talk about experimental Mishaux. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here to talk about Michaux and to engage with ideas around Michaux that are challenging and that are making me question a lot of the work that I've done on him in a good way. What I want to do today is to give an overview of his work, both literary and visual, to provide a context for his Mescaline drawings. I want to show how these investigations are characteristic of an experimental attitude that could be seen in different patterns of his visual and verbal production throughout his life. And these patterns interrogate the interaction between writing and drawing and often use the body as a site of experimentation. What I want to show is that the experimentation with drugs presents a change to Michaux's literary and artistic output, whilst remaining in a similar experimental trajectory. It highlights his understanding of contemporary scientific and medical developments, and his use, as I've said before, of his own body as a site of experimentation. I'm going to be a broken record on that, I think, today. Many tensions exist in the 5 major works composed under the influence of drugs. And Oliver's been talking about some of them already. So between poetic and scientific discourses, the poet-scientist being both the subject and the object of his experimentation, or between writing and drawing as adequate expressive means to convey this mind-altering experience. I think we're going to be talking much more about that today. I hope so anyway. So, who is Michaux? So he was born in Belgium, not very enamoured by Belgium, it has to be said, in 1899 and died in Paris in 1984. So, a really long and varied career there. He's a writer and an artist too, and he gains recognition in both these fields, which are often separate, for over half a century. So I would argue, many have argued, this isn't new, that very few, although many artists are not very bothered about these labels, unlike academics like myself. But very few artists have been able to express themselves as successfully as Michaux, using both textual and visual means. So William Blake, Victor Hugo, Jean Arp are other eminent examples of what people have called double artists, and that idea of doubling is that Oliver's touched on is coming up already. So his international reputation as a visual artist was officially established when he won the Einaudi Prize at the 1960 Venice Biennale, and he accepted this prize whilst refusing various literary prizes, which is indicative of his attitude to these different practices. So, as we know, exhibitions have been dedicated to his artistic work all over the world, and that's why we're here today, thanks to Ketty and the superb exhibition at the Courtauld. It's so wonderful to see these drawings together, to see them together in London as well. That's quite breathtaking. I was just starting my PhD on Michaux in 1999 when the Whitechapel exhibition took place. So it was a very important exhibition for me and my thinking about Michaux, and the film Images du Monde Visionnaire about the mescaline experience was shown there in its entirety. So Michaux didn't receive any formal artistic training, but his artistic output obtained much success and continues to do so today. Franck, I don't think he'll talk about this, but it is fantastic book on Michaux. He's got a chapter on fake Michaux, and it's just quite extraordinary when you see a fake how bad they are. Yeah, there is something about the way he orders his signs, his lines, which is quite extraordinary. So, although a respected visual artist, Michaux is probably best known in France for his poetic texts. Although I think this may well be changing as attitudes to reading change. But one of the famous texts is a text about a character called Plume, so feather. And Michaux recounts the chaplainesque adventures of this fictional character who gets himself in all sorts of fixes, basically. He can't avoid coming up against order, convention in the most absurd situations. So, for example, Plume au restaurant, so Plume goes to the restaurants. When the eponymous character gets into trouble in a restaurant, first with the waiter, then the manager, then the police commissioner, and finally the secret police, all for ordering a pork chop, an item which isn't on the menu, okay? So this may sound, for people who are familiar with Mr. Bean, rather like Mr. Bean, but it is absurd, obviously, but it's also nothing like this. It's violent, it's awful, but brilliantly awful. So Michaux generally used his poetic writing, which has been translated into many different languages, to defend himself against the hostile conditions of the outside world and to explore his inner being and imagination in order to attempt to find knowledge or the process of this. He didn't consider himself a poet, however, and his poetic texts do not follow the traditional conventions of rhyme and metre. They instead mostly take form in a sort of journal or diary in verse and prose that relates real or invented experiences. His wide range of literary and artistic activities, as well as an eager interest in other expressive forms and science, all contribute to this idea that he was more than a poet. His output was varied in both literary and artistic fields, so he wrote prose and poetry. He not only painted using watercolour, gouache, acrylic and oil, there's pastel I think up here, but he also created and drew new alphabets using a variety of instruments, including brushes and fibre-tipped pens. This varied range of creative practices was matched in his private life by extensive travel to Asia, to South America, and he wrote travel narratives about these, so real travel narratives, but he also writes imaginary travel narratives. And there's also a real distinctive interest in music, which underpins his work as well. So Michaux explores the possibilities of outer and above all inner reality using visual and verbal means, sometimes separately, but more often than not in conjunction. He's ultimately concerned with escaping the limitations of everyday language in order to express effectively the body's movement and the speed of the thought process, and thus gain a further understanding of the inner self. And I've got a quotation. I will read the English, you've got the French, for those who speak French. I ran out of time, this is not my translation, I think it's David Ball's From Darkness Moves. I'm not entirely sure though, so apologies about that. So instead of one vision excluding others, I would have liked to draw the moments that little by little make up life, to let people see the phrase within, the phrase without words, a rope indefinitely unrolling, winding, accompanying in its intimacy all that comes in from the outside and the inside too. I wanted to draw the consciousness of existing and the flow of time, as you might take your pulse, or again on a more limited scale, what appears when the evening has come and the film of impression created by the day plays back to you, muted though and shorter, a cinematic drawing. So the visual and verbal are intricately intertwined and should be regarded, in my opinion, as having parallel importance in Michaux's works. His first book, Qui je fus, was published in the same year, 1927, as this work, his initial experimentation with alphabets, which is called Alphabet. Accordingly, much of Michaux's literary production expresses his desire to transcend conventional linguistic systems and his joy at discovering a more immediate expressive form in the visual arts, whilst paradoxically, much of his artistic output conveys a close resemblance to writing systems and bears witness to a desire for a universal sign system. These two expressive forms seem to thrive on a mutually beneficial relationship in which any generic division is shattered. So any attempt to classify Michaux's visual or verbal production in terms of absolute and mutually exclusive categories appears to be thwarted from the very start by this interaction between text and image, as well as his own very well documented aversion to being placed in a group or movement, be it artistic or literary. There are, of course, certain pertinent and very useful affinities to be drawn with other artists and writers of his time, such as the Surrealists and the practitioners of informal arts, in terms of their context, their similar objectives and their mutual influence. Jonathan Jones reviewed the Mescaline Drawing exhibition at the Courtauld, really talking about Michaux as a surrealist, and I would argue that Michaux isn't a surrealist, but nevertheless that's really helpful because it's going to get people into the exhibition. So that, yeah, it's an interesting way of thinking about him too. It's become a commonplace in studies on Michaux to suggest that once he'd discovered images, so drawing and painting, that he gradually stopped writing. And this is very much to do with how he's writing about this as well. But he never stopped writing. That's really important to remember. He didn't even publish substantially less. And so in the research that I've done on him, I've made the claim that a large part of his visual production is about writing. So he started this infamous experimentation with drugs in the mid-1950s, in his 50s, which I think is quite incredible too. This specific creative period gave rise to much literary and artistic production. The drawings, Les Dessins Mescaliniens, brought him instant recognition and were widely exhibited from the very beginning. So this line of inquiry lasts for over a decade, and he doesn't do any of his other visual and verbal production at this time. He's concentrated on this experimentation. It provides the circumstances for the 5 major publications that Oliver outlined at the beginning of his talk, and they all deal with his output under the influence of various hallucinogenic substances. So this experimentation with drugs obviously belongs to a long-standing practice of drug-taking amongst poets and artists from the Western world, and so makes indirect reference to figures such as De Quincey on opium, Baudelaire on hashish, Artaud on peyote, and Rimbaud's dérèglement de tous les sens, so dismantling of all the senses. And most directly, and Oliver's already mentioned this, Huxley's Doors of Perception, the first literary text about mescaline. And yeah, I absolutely agree with Oliver about Michaux's representations of this experience being much richer. We'll come back to that, no doubt. So from opinions expressed by Michaux in a rare conference on poetry in 1936, which appeared to foresee the experimentation with hallucinogenic substances undertaken some 20 years later, it's clear that a quest for secondary and extreme, even dangerous inner states, alongside general scientific and technological knowledge, are paramount to what he regarded as the role and function of the modern poets. From an early age, he was interested in science with a close link to human beings, such as medicine and psychoanalysis. He studied medicine for a year, and some of his very first articles published in Le Disque Vert also confirm knowledge and engagement with psychoanalysis. So he's not the only artist experimenting with, or writer, experimenting with extreme physical and mental states at the time. The Surrealists, and especially Robert Desnos, were also exploring the creative consequences of states of semi-consciousness. The Catalan visual artist Juan Miró writes of his own unintended discovery of the hallucinogenic possibilities offered by extreme hunger during the period in which he frequented the Surrealist poets. Jules Supervielle, Michaux's mentor during his first years in Paris, tells of the poet-artist's experimentation with hunger and his aim of reaching hitherto unknown physical and mental states. So, that's all leading me to be able to say that Michaux uses his own body as a site of experimentation. And he affirms that he considers the self, his body, his mind, as a type of benchmark. Much of his visual and verbal output attempts to express his body's reactions when pushed in either premeditated or spontaneous fashion to its limits. The majority of his texts, produced under the influence of mescaline, deal with conscious experiences where he has set the limits. His famous overdose constitutes an exception, although this could be considered inevitable when you're experimenting with substances of this nature in a prolonged systematic way. But there are other very surprising examples of him experimenting or using his body as a site of experimentation. So an example of an unexpected experience with drugs is related many years later in a text called Par surprise, by surprise. So during the latter experience, Michaux was furious with himself for not having thought through the consequences of spontaneously ingesting a considerable amount of an unknown substance. And yet, and this is where it's just breathtaking really, whereas others might have panicked, especially at over 80 years of age, he calmly decides to make the most of the situation and to observe the effects of this unidentified product on his own mental and physical functioning. And this produces a text. He even considers illnesses and accidents as having creative possibilities. For example, when he breaks his arm, this accident gives rise to a new perception of the body and leads Michaux to the discovery of the left-hand man, the man on the left, and a text on this subject called Broken Arm, Bras cassé. The same pattern is repeated when he breaks his Achilles tendon. This accident produces a text recording his experience. And well before the mescaline years, Michaux had already experimented with certain drugs. In Ecuador, so a travel text about Latin America, published in 1929, in this text, he relates his experience of taking ether, laudanum, and opium. So the foreword to Misérables Miracles, oh, I had a Mescaline drawing to show you in between, which I forgot. The foreword to Misérables Miracles points to the interdisciplinary nature of Michaux's production under the influence of mescaline, and to the complicated process of conveying this within the confines of the conventional written page. And Oliver's shown us some pages from this text, which is really helpful here. So I'll read the English quotation, the English translation. Since I could not present the manuscript itself, which directly translated the subject, rhythms, shapes, and chaos altogether, as well as the inner defences and their breakdowns, we found ourselves in great difficulty, facing a typographical wall. Everything had to be rewritten. In any case, the original text, easier to feel than to read, as much drawn as written, would never have been adequate. Any clear distinction between the written and drawn line is shattered as a letter or word tails off in a doodle that never quite becomes an image, or a vibrating zigzag becomes a word. Michaux's scribbled notes, transcribed in Misérables Miracles, constitute a type of infralanguage, where both drawing and writing are called upon in an attempt to convey the altered reality, which can be both terrible and sublime, experienced through the medium of drugs. The text in Misérables Miracles does not follow typographical norms, as we saw earlier, as it contains words in the margin. These are types of key words from the text and could be described as a type of mathematical root. They convey and often repeat the essential and are inextricably linked to the chemical formula for the synthetic mescaline molecule that opens this book. So the marginalia, combined with the scribbled notes and drawings in Misérables Miracles, suggest a particular type of reading practice, which no longer follows linear conventions. So Michaux's visions and the means he uses to capture them, writing or drawing, often take on multiple significations under the influence of mescaline. So I'm going to talk about the ends that Oliver's already talked about. The famous passage, we'll say that. For example, when confronted with the spectacle of the Himalayas, Michaux starts repeating the word immense, in his head, and soon the letter M of this word becomes distorted and begins to represent other objects, such as lasso hoops and cathedral arches. Words and letters take on a pictographic function by representing figuratively certain objects. In a later mescaline text, Pied en ébrisement, peace and breaking, a similar pattern is repeated. The letter S acquires snake-like qualities, recreating the onomatopoeic link between the object and the letter. And ultimately, during the mescaline experiments, Michaux becomes the letter, the line. This is the thing shaped and the shaper that Oliver's talking about. So some critics consider Pied en ébrisement, peace and breaking, to be the peak of Michaux's artistic and literary production, believing it to be a type of Gesamtkunstwerk in which the drawings, essays, and poem form a whole which cannot be divided. Here, he uses the physical properties of the book itself to render the infinite nature of the hallucinogenic experience, and drawing in other interests and investigations here too. So both drawings and text follow a vertical direction across the horizontal spine of the book, leaving no gap or margin, rather like a Chinese scroll. So here the reproductions are from the Pleiades. So they don't do that in the Pleiad. They don't let you turn the book round. But the original book, which is a large book, you read it. You don't read it page by page in a conventional way. So the verse no longer takes heed of the vertical position of the book's spine, and the reader is encouraged to change his or her reading habits by turning the book around until its spine is in a horizontal position. So the unique nature of Pied en ébrisement owes much to Michaux's experimentation with the Oriental book form, the scroll, which he declared would suit his needs far better than the divisional Western book. So Pied dans l'Épuisement establishes a radical critique of the Western book form in relation to the Chinese writing system. So I think, yeah, what I'm really interested in the medium that Michaux uses for writing drawings, so whether it be in the book or using a canvas, using a sheet of paper from a drawing pad, but also how he experiments with that too. And I think that could be, something that I can pursue a little bit in discussions with Oliver about this. So, the Mescaline experiments represent a unique period of intense experimentation. The final years of Michaux's life are characterised by a certain meditative outlook, which could be said to be a direct result of the revelations produced under the influence of hallucinogenic substances. It may appear a cliché, but during the last decades of his life, an almost mystical serenity surrounded both him and his artistic and literary production. Indeed, towards the end of his life, he was engaged in the practice of various Oriental philosophies. There are texts such as Une voie pour l'insubordination, which underline a renewed interest in mysticism and sainthood, which had first been expressed through his choice of reading matter as a teenager. The peaceful and somehow fulfilled nature of some of his later texts can also, however, be attributed to the spiritual, quasi-religious revelations experienced after taking mescaline, which led to texts such as Vers la complétude. So the tone of these texts, and that's interesting, is diametrically opposed to the more hostile, aggressive nature of some of Michaux's earlier poems, poetic texts. So I'm coming to the end. Michaux's research into hallucinogenic substances could be said to continue an experimental trajectory that included numerous literary and artistic activities, in addition to travel and music, often blurring the generic distinctions between these normally discrete practices. Through these investigations, Michaux aimed to transcend any singular norm, classification, or genre in order to devise a new thought system. This new thought system should in turn incite a form of expression that would enable the creator to render the dynamic nature of the inner self, this process, this experience. So I'm going to close on a type of coda, because this exhibition, I hope this is not going to be self-indulgent. You can tell me off for being self-indulgent once I finish. But this exhibition, thinking about Michaux for the talk today, a lot of time has passed since I did my PhD on Michaux, and it's really interesting to return to his work in it with a different lens as well. So what I was trying to do with my work then was to understand his experimentation with size. And there are 4 books, I've got some images from them here, that span his life. So the first one's published in 1951, and the last one posthumously in 1984. So it's an experimentation that he returns to throughout his life. So when I was trying to do this work, the drug works were a major challenge, a major obstacle in trying to make sense of these size, because he stops doing them during that period, in how I understand them. Obviously, he's still writing and drawing. So the drug experimentation constitutes a major disruption, although I tried to explain in a similar experimental vein. I find these drug works, but this is why they're interesting. I find them difficult, I find them really challenging and even frightening. They're vertiginous. You get sucked in, and they're very difficult to remove yourself from. That's part of the point, right? That's why they're good. I criticised them in my PhD for being repetitive. What a cheek, now I think back. I was hiding behind, I think, a very major figure in French studies in the UK, Malcolm Bowie, an extraordinarily an extraordinary writer on French poetry, quite difficult to move around when you're doing a PhD. But now, thinking about it, reading Oliver's work, trying to engage with this in a different way, those are some pages from Mouvement, the first book of signs. I'm interested in the signs precisely because of their repetitive nature. Yeah, these signs, it's all about repetition and all about variation in repetition. Also, all about dismantling forms, so creation through destruction as well. So there is much, much more for me to explore in relation to the drug works. And I would say, and I'll finish on this act of returning to something, to engage with it again and again, is at the heart of Michaux's experimental attitude. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really brilliant. And it's good, actually, I think, after a few years to sort of go back to earlier research in this way. And I was intrigued to hear that actually you sort of felt a little bit of that difficulty at the time to engage with them, because they are really unique, despite being maybe repetitive. So thank you. I'm going now to introduce Muriel Pic, who is a freelance researcher, writer and filmmaker who has taught at universities in France, Germany and Switzerland. Her work explores the connections that take shape between thought and poetry, document and fiction, science and art, imagination and knowledge. This has yielded a body of work that combines poetry, documentary narratives, lyrical essays, and text formed from archival materials. And Henri Michaux is one of the artists and writers who she has been interested in, but also Rosa Luxemburg, Sebald, and she has really worked on several of these literary works, and I urge you to sort of check her on the internet and find several of the wonderful material that you can see there. The title of her presentation today is Psychedelic versus Psychopharmacological, Experimental Alienation by Henri Michaux. Thank you, Muriel.
I'm glad to be here, and yes, I would like to thank again Ketty, Gottardo and the organizers for this invitation, this perfect invitation. When Henri Michaux was experimenting between 1955 and 1965, clinical and therapeutics research using hallucinogen had a very specific aim: to imitate madness. Because if you want to cure it, you have to understand it from the inside. So it was really the aim: imitate madness. The experiments are called, at this time, artificial madness, voluntary madness, experimental madness, experimental psychosis, experimental schizophrenia, and madness in miniature. In the archives of the drug, Michaux writes alienation experimentale, for what the term alienation, etymologically says about foreign presence within oneself and a state of possession. While he usually did so at home, Michaux gradually entered in the experimental circle of scientists and pharmaceutical laboratories working in the field, including Jean Delay at the Sainte-Anne Psychiatric Hospital, chemist Albert Hoffmann at the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland, and Roger Heim at the Muséum National d'Histoire, au Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. For Michaux, the scientist dimension of his literary and plastic research with drug is very important. That's why he puts the formula for mescaline at the beginning of Misérable Miracle. It also appears on the invitation card for the first exhibition of Mescaline Drawing in London in 1957. And I had the card, but I didn't send the right PDF, so sorry. Next time. Unlike today's proponents of psychedelic medicine, doctors in Michaux's times were not looking for direct therapy with hallucinogens. They did not use them to find psychic well-being, but to explore the confines of consciousness in order to understand madness. For them, the major hallucinogens led to states of madness akin to schizophrenia, and I quote Sandoz, using LSD, it is possible to provoke a temporary mental state reminiscent of schizophrenia, bipolar and manic depressive disorders. This property offers psychiatrists the opportunity, valuable for more than one reason, to try the substance themselves and thus to enter the mental world of mental patients for a few hours. Michaux is fascinated by madness, and he wants to know it. He wrote that he wants to put himself in the shoes of mad people, as you can see, dans leur peau, in the shoes, I think it's the expression with the correspondence, dans leur peau, in the shoes of mad people. To be a madman for a day or a couple of hours, to be temporarily mad, to find out what madness has to say, what it can do. Such was the literary and scientific dream, the utopia and indeed the folly that Michaux shared with a generation of doctors who experimented with psychotropic drugs. It was the time for a psychopharmacological revolution in Europe. Science was discovering and learning how to control substances that act on the brain. The pharmaceutical industry was about to start producing all kinds of psychotropic drugs, from the neuroleptics, which combat schizophrenic psychosis, to the anxiolytics, hypnotics, and antidepressants, which treats neurosis. But there is more. According to the scientists of the time, neuroleptic can also stop the effect of the major hallucinogens that were gradually being discovered at the times, notably mescaline, LSD, and psilocybin. Science finally had the power to control the artificial madness, an on-off switch. For pharmaceutical laboratories, hallucinogen research is only a part of the story, but an important part, which is featured on the cover, for example, of a medical journal such as Panorama. You can see psilocybin. Because these substances come from plants, cacti, and mushrooms. And when Sandoz produces Delicid, which is a pharmaceutical LSD, it accompanies the products with a very precise and serious instruction. We put it in the catalogue of the exhibition. It was in this context and in collaboration with doctors that Michaux regularly took drugs. It was time for the psychopharmacological revolution, 10 years before the psychedelic revolution. The term psychopharmacological is invented in 1956 by Pierre Deniker, the assistant of Jean Delay in Sainte-Anne. We can hear the Greek word pharmakon in the word psychopharmacological, which means cure or poison. To be more precise, a new discipline was born, named psychopharmacology, which resulted from the meeting of the behavioral sciences and pharmacology, or the science of drug action, which owes its progress to the achievements of modern chemistry. That same years, 1956, the term psychedelic was coined by the Dr. Humphrey Osmond as a poem on the back of a letter sent to him by the writer Aldous Huxley on the 30 March 1956. He wrote 2 lines, here you have the documents. To plumb the depths of Sir Angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. The word psychedelic comes from a rhyme with angelic, and it's very beautiful. In another letter dated 24 May 1957, Huxley reported to the Dr. Osmond on his reading of Miserable Miracle, in which he is mentioned only once in the notes. While he found the book well written, he was surprised by what Mishaux described as an overdose episode. It was, so sorry, I don't know, I sent I made a mistake with my PDF. Here it's a very nice, it's a card for the first exhibition of Mescaline Drawing of Henri Michaux in London. Unfortunately, I found it too late for the exhibition and the catalog. But and he put, as you see, they choose to put the Mescaline formula. Okay, so we come back to Huxley. So it's what Huxley is saying, is telling his writing about Miserable Miracle. I will read it, but with my accent it will be very funny, so enjoy it. I have read Mishaux's Miserable Miracle. It is well written. Perhaps I'm being pedantic, but it seems to me that what happened was not the effect of an overdose of mescaline at all. He had previously taken minimal quantities of mescaline, 100 milligrams, a fourth of your first dose, which is hardly enough to do more than push one into the psychotic fringe. Then, for reasons that are unclear, he took 600 milligrams in error. He then became very much afraid and, not surprisingly, had the most unpleasant experience. Oddly, he makes almost no direct references to this. I have seen no discussion of technical problems involved in making use of psychedelics. But Mishaux's perspective is, in the other hand, absolutely not that of Huxley's psychedelic mysticism. Mishaux was critical, very critical of American psychedelia. He compares the person involved in the psychedelic revolution with, I quote, Miserable Miracle, journalists who have been invited to the crucifixion. In his 1972 retrospective book Emergence Résurgence, Mishaux unexpectedly refers to his session with drug as a psychedelic experience. There is only one time in all his writing this term, psychedelic experience, for his own experimentation. And he refers to the culture associated with them. He reproduces works, for example, from the journal L'Art Psychédélique, which devoted an article to his film Images du Monde Visionnaire. So maybe that's right. But despite his ambivalence with the psychedelic revolution, we must keep in mind that Mishaux was above all interested in madness, but also in creation. He wanted to write and paint in tune with sensation. As I told before, he seeks to become mad, or more precisely, to have the sensation of being mad. For madness is not his only focus. His research is also geared towards trying to capture the sensation. He wants to listen to the body in a state of disorder, because listening to the body is also listening to rhythm and vibration, listening to words and lines. Here, for example, on this page, he writes in large type, but I think my translation is, I don't know if I should, violence until I align myself with the new vibration, or violated, I'm not sure about. Violenter jusqu'à ce que je m'aligne sur la vibration nouvelle. Violenter jusqu'à ce que je m'aligne sur la vibration nouvelle. So, I will make the conclusion. I have been working on Henri Michaux and his drug experiments since 2012. In 2014, I published Mescaline 55, a collection of letters and testimony about Michaux's first 3 days of mescaline experiments with Jean Paulhan and Edith Boissonnat. Throughout these years, I have worked on the notes taken by Michaux on drugs and the archives of the scientists with whom he collaborates on this experiment Alienation. I'm preparing to publish 2 books. The first in September will be devoted exclusively to Michaux and his experiments. And I work with his drugs archive. The other book brings together the self-observation of doctors on drug between the end of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century. This anthology is based on Michaux's own reading, and he read a great deal of self-observation in order to set up a protocol and a self-technique. Why I'm telling that? Because the important things for me in this research and on this question is, 1, to show how Michaux appropriates the writing of medical self-observation on drugs. To show the dual nature of his literary and visual works. They are literary works and documents for scientists, drawing and writing, both. It's document and it's literary and visual works. There is something like the invention of documentary lyricism by Michaux. 3. The importance of artists and writers in the scientific revolution. Doctors at that time need people who can bear witness through drawing and writing. I think it's vital to be aware of this kind of collaboration at a time when the separation of the arts and science is being pushed to the extreme, despite the so-called interdisciplinary attempts. 4. Putting down marker in the history of madness in the 20th century, helping us to understand how the psychotropic drugs we take every day were invented. What I want to say is my research perspective is not militant. If I read Michaux and the doctors who made the first self-observation, the risk of suicide is real because of the hallucinations when you take hallucinogen. Michaux goes so far as to say that those who hallucinate are victimized by the images. However, in a work of palliative care, it appears that microdosing offers possibilities for relieving certain patients. Microdosing is fundamental for Michaux. During his experiments, he always proceeded by taking very, very small quantities gradually. For Henri Michaux, if hallucinogen opens up a mystical path, it is in a paradoxical or dialectical mode. And to conclude, I quote from the Drug Archive, which illustrates what I just said. Infinity is torture or beatitude, in other words, experimental. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this beginning, which was really terrific. Maybe I'll just start with a comment, and then please do raise any question you may have. this is something I definitely didn't sort of think about at all while working on the exhibition, was the sort of several references that you have made to the body, to what, of course, I mean, yeah, what mescaline does to the body. Because for me, sort of looking at the drawings, it was always about the kind of, visions and ideas that would have come out of that experience that translated onto the paper. But of course, there is a repeated violence to the body. And what you sort of mentioned about the broken arm and how it sort of it took this clearly as a positive effect to make him think differently or artistically, creatively differently in what he produced afterwards. So that was really something that sort of got from your presentation, that sort of raised a few thoughts and in my mind. And is there anything else that you want to sort of comment on that, or any other sort of texts that that are specifically useful when thinking at these effects on the body?
I mean, people who like mescaline, people who like to take mescaline, always say it is a very bodily, it's of all the psychedelics, it gives you a very kind of embodied high. It's much less cerebral in terms of its kind of affordances than some of the others. I mean, it is interesting that when he was taking the psychedelics, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but he mainly took them with his body static, or more or less static, much in the way that, in the psychedelic renaissance in biomedicine, people are mainly static and mainly kind of, looking at their eye shields on or something. So the body is kind of rendered corpse-like almost in those experiments. I mean, part of the problem I think with psychedelic mysticism, insofar as it's understood even in the experimentation, is that it's become a very psychologized, very mentalistic understanding of mysticism. So you have to, if you go back to the medieval mystics, Christian mystics and others, that's a really kind of a body, it's an embodied rapture, and I think in a way the psychedelic renaissance would do well to kind of try and rediscover the body and move away from neurocomputationalist fixation.
If you go through the archives, you can see that there is a link between Bureaucracy and the book and the books about drug. And this link is the notion of synesthesia. I don't know how to translate it. Synesthesia in English. And synesthesia is the idea to be listening at the body when you are in trouble because of disease, like a broken arm, and or under drugs. Your perception are not are absolutely not the same as usual, and so synesthesia starts to give some synesthesia catch sensations, and he wants to work with this inside, I don't know how to describe it, but the words come in both books, and it was very common in the psychiatric vocabulary at this time. Mm-hmm. And Jean Starobinski found this word by Mishaux in Bureaucracy, and then he developed two research, one in history of medicine about synesthesia and the other one through the literary field with Perec, Beckett, but he didn't finish his research. Starobinsky just made some courses at the university about this notion of synesthesia, l'écoute du corps, the listening how to listen at the body and become a way to listen at the words and the line, and you can also make a link with all the with the work of Michaux, with the text of Michaux about Paul Klee, becoming line.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know.
Thank you. Are there, a question?
Yeah, I came to this partly because I'm a bit sceptical about all this rise of psychedelics, and I just think about, middle class people with too much money going to take ayahuasca for a week or something. And I think this third very interesting paper, when you describe this sort of tourism of madness, this temporary stepping into madness that you describe, that sort of summed up for me a certain kind of bourgeois attitude. But my problem is that it seems to be a kind of extremely artificial idea that you can visit madness. Madness is precisely something which is all-encompassing. And I just wonder whether any of you factor in something which is against the spirit of this conference, which unites psychiatry and art. Do any of you factor in anti-psychiatry, R.D. Lang, David Cooper, when you think about the kind of span between those early psychedelics and the current thing now? Because it seems to me that is the problem, and that is where all the difficulties are openly discussed.
Well, Lang was a great enthusiast for LSD, as you probably know. So did lots of experiments with LSD provided by Sandoz, and there are lots of people.
Lang said psychiatrists don't understand madness.
There are lots of people working in the psychedelic space today in biomedicine. Obviously, I'm not one of them, but who are very skeptical about psychiatry, about the institution of psychiatry and what it's done historically. So. There is, it's not just a psychiatric, it's not just an unreconstructed psychiatric project. I would say also with regard to the psychotomimetic paradigm, obviously in the history of psychiatry, that goes way back into the 19th century, into Moreau de Tours, in particular. And if you read Foucault on le pouvoir psychiatrique, then you see Foucault talking about Moreau de Tours and what is basically the psychotomimetic paradigm. And I was really interested to hear what you were saying, Muriel, about that. And it's true. It's true. It was the kind of dominant paradigm, wasn't it, in science at the time? But it was in the process of kind of collapsing about this time as well. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's. So I would say there is a real anti-psychiatry. There's an anti-psychiatric strand within the psychedelic renaissance.
Yes, Michael.
Thank you. Following on which I'd like a question that's about the potentially the politics of Michaux from today's perspective. On a slightly facetious note, Oliver, when you were mentioning the two M's in immense and like Baroque cathedrals, and then you mentioned Nina, the poetry at the Pays Brisement with the Pays Gothique. I was immediately thinking of these two M's of the Golden Arches of McDonald's, and with your mentioning of the difference between signs and writing, the emojis that we all now communicate within our phones. And then when you were talking about Huxley's reading of it, I wonder how much now the Soma, coming back to your point about what Michaux's take on capitalism would have been. If you remember in Brave New World, everyone is sedated with Soma to make them conform to the world. So I wonder if you could comment on that, where you think his politics would have laid if he'd lasted another, if he'd had a view of where we are now. McDonald's and Soma.
For myself, I can't imagine Mishaux on Facebook, for example. It's not possible. I mean, so
it is, yeah. I worked quite a lot on digital poetry after working on Mishaux, and it was thinking about interaction between text and image, and the medium being used and things like that. And I think when I was working on the experimentation with signs and thinking about cinema in relation to that, and the experimentation going on Michaux wasn't interested in that at all. He wasn't interested in doing that sort of experimentation. And the film, the related to the drug experiences, is not to do with form in that way. So it's really hard to say. For the politics, he's really difficult to get a grasp on. You're thinking his work through in terms of the molecular, aren't you? And it's not something that he made pronouncements on. He wasn't that sort of politically committed writer. Yeah.
I mean, soma is an opioid. I think it's that kind of drug. It's the kind of drug that you take. You need to take it. It's an addictive drug, and that makes reality bearable in Brave New World. Psychedelics are not addictive. And a lot of the way they're used in therapeutically now, as probably we'll hear later, is with 2 or 3 big kind of doses, big trips, and they work to de-automate. Yeah, so they don't create the pattern of addiction. And politically, I think they're extremely powerful. So if you think about the kind of addictive quality of some antidepressant drugs as well. So if you take people who are kind of living in desperate circumstances and who may be unemployed or have precarious employment and are increasingly affected by the pressures that in a way we're all under around the cost of living and political despair. If they're being medicated on antidepressants, that's a kind of soma type situation. Whereas for me, these are drugs with huge kind of potential to restore a sense of one's own capacity for meaningful political participation. And if you're reading Thoreau, for instance, talking about the 19th century, it's that kind of despair of quiet despair of the majority that is a kind of real, genuine kind of problem for democracy. Because democracy, unlike other regimes, requires that we all as citizens are active in our political engagement. So if psychedelics can make us more active in that way, in a way that soma and opioids and antidepressants don't, then I think that's all for the good. That's kind of what I try to outline in the book.
Thank you. And conscious of the time, I think that we'll go to coffee now, and you can ask those questions there, because otherwise we'll be too late for the later session. I will introduce now Vanessa Tothill, who is curator of transhistorical narratives at the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich. Her current exhibition is titled Eyewitness and will open. The current project she's working on is an exhibition that will open in September 25 as part of Can We Stop Killing Each Other season. Vanessa has curated a series of exhibitions, including power plants, intoxicants, stimulants, and narcotics, which happened in 2024. And she was the Sainsbury Centre curator of the touring exhibition Ayahuasca and the Art of the Amazon, and editor of a book, which I think she was holding earlier, Why Do We Take Drugs?, published in 2024, which I had the chance of seeing in Norwich and was really very interesting. And so I'm sure that beyond mescaline, you'll be talking about many other types of drugs. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this workshop. I know very little about Henri Michaux, so this has really been an education. We do have two. Thank you. We do have two works in the collection. I think one is currently on display, but apparently they were produced after his mescaline period. So please come and have a look. So recently, maybe over the past 2 or 3 years, we've introduced a new way of programming exhibitions at the Sainsbury Centre, and this is following the arrival of Jago Cooper, and he wanted us to change the way we worked with the space. So instead of doing lots of very disparate, very different exhibitions across the Sainsbury Centre, we'd have one overriding question that maybe taps more into the social sciences, and that maybe relates a bit more to contemporary questions that people might have and might be asking themselves. So this is where this question, why do we take drugs, came from. Maybe it's a question that most people have on their mind. Maybe at some point they've considered using drugs, or they have used drugs. So yeah, interestingly, it was a very, very successful program. I think we've had our highest visitor figures ever on the back of this program. We did try to create some kind of balance across the whole Sainsbury Centre. So we looked at different kinds of community and social uses of drugs, problems attached to drug use. So we were hoping that we would give a balanced interpretation of drug cultures. I think some people would say that we achieved that, and other people maybe came away quite angry, feeling that we were advocates for drug use because we weren't telling them, don't do drugs, which is what usually people hear, don't do drugs. Okay, let's see what I've... Okay, so first of all, we had this question, should people take drugs? Why do people take drugs? And I got in touch with Mike J, because I knew he'd worked on an exhibition for the Wellcome collection, called High Society, and he said that's just othering drug use. You can't have people push it onto other people, because most of us are using drugs of some kind. So I went back to the director and we decided to make it a more embracing question, why do we take drugs? So I worked on the exhibitions in the lower galleries at the Sainsbury Centre, and this comprised of two exhibitions, Power Plants, Intoxicants, Stimulants and Narcotics, and the other one was a touring exhibition from Paris that was curated by David Dupuy at the Musée de Quai Branly. So I don't know if anyone got to see that ayahuasca art exhibition, but it was great. Unfortunately, we were able to bring it to the Sainsbury Centre. So the first thing we needed to do was look at the word drug, because that is so stigmatised. It immediately would turn off a lot of visitors. It also imposed a very Western idea on certain substances that were being consumed and had been consumed for millennia around the world in a very respectful or even in a religious context, or spiritual context, I should say. So yeah, we had to rethink that word drug. And so I came up with intoxicants, stimulants and narcotics, which is again quite a scientific way of breaking down that terminology. Then we also had the Western 20th century terms like entheogens, which is like inducing God within, psychedelics, mind manifesting, psychoactive. These all sort of, again, had a very Western feel to them. And perhaps a more sympathetic term, or sympathetic terms, were plant teachers, plant spirits, sacred plants, plant healers, plant sacraments, and plants of power. So we kind of embraced that terminology. There was actually one artist in the ayahuasca exhibition that said ayahuasca isn't a drug. And because we wanted to use Sara Flores' work on the cover, we had to sort of work very closely with her to use language that she would accept, because she did not like that word drugs, and for her ayahuasca was something else. It was a very spiritual substance that it was enriching to their society, their community, the art she produced, and so on. We also wanted to make people rethink what the word drug could include. So anything that really changed your body chemistry or your mood. So we did include caffeine. We could have also included sugar. We wanted to emphasise the cultural, spiritual and the ritual significance of different substances. Okay, so this is sort of going to be a tour of the first exhibition, and this is the power plants exhibition. Fortunately, well, I should explain that Sainsbury's Centre, within the building, we have offices that belong to the Sainsbury Research Unit, and they are archaeologists, anthropologists, so they have lots of students working in the field and doing research. And so we drew on their skills, and these photographs were taken by one of the students, the PhD students, who was in Papua New Guinea, and he was friendly with the community there. He was using betel and chewing betel, so he had an insight into that drug culture, which we were able to bring to our audiences. So in this picture here, you can see one of the photographs he took of betel nuts or areca nuts and lime being sold at the market, and you can also see the lime sticks in the background. So we sort of opened the exhibition with this collection. We tried to focus on substances that were linked to the permanent Sainsbury Centre collection, because we have lots of vessels, like anthropological, ethnographical objects that relate to smoking, or containers that carry lime. We've got carver bowls, so we tried to incorporate as many objects as we could from our own permanent collections, and that shaped the look of the exhibition overall. We also went to Kew, and they were wonderful and gave us a tour of their collection. And so from them we took objects that related to the use of snuff and smoking of tobacco. So here we're mainly focusing on objects from Africa and South Africa, and in cultures in South Africa, snuff is taken to connect with ancestors, and it's used to summon ancestors who are thought to be hungry for snuff. And so snuff is scattered, praise words are said, and then favour is asked of the ancestors, or advice is sought. We were also able to display two works by Sitembile Msizane, who's a contemporary South African artist. She produced these two works during COVID lockdown when she was at the Sainsbury Centre. So we were pleased to bring these works out again. She cast her own hand in wax and her own handmade snuff, and there you can see she's sort of sprinkling the snuff to call the ancestors. She also made this digital work, which is quite whimsical. It's inspired by a snuff box that opens and plays a tune like a music box. And she was working with our collection because we have a bone snuff spoon in the collection, and that's the starting point for that, for those two pieces. And here we have, this is more directly linked to mescaline. So within the Sainsbury Research Unit, there's a PhD student called Anai Luna, who's originally from Mexico. She had previously exhibited ritual artworks, so she had already done the research. Currently, she's researching women's tattoos in Papua New Guinea, so this was slightly different to what her PhD is about. But she had this insight and the contacts. And she'd also taken mescaline, so we thought perfect curator to work on this section on ritual art. We had a good relationship with Musée de Quai Branly, so we were fortunate to be able to borrow these votive offerings. So we have the rattle, the ritual arrow, that sends wishes and prayers to the gods, and then the votive bowl, which also had wax and yarn work within it, and then this peyote hat that's made from feathers that's supposed to resemble the peyote cactus. She was trying to explain that when the pilgrims, when they are hunting for peyote, it's a form of solar worship, and it sort of concludes the dry season, and it's supposed to ensure that there will be rains in the rainy season, and that will bring forth a good harvest. So it's sort of built into their sort of ritual and agricultural calendar. But when you take the peyote, you sort of become the cactus. So you feel like the light is coming out from within you, and this hat is supposed to be like the flowers coming out of the top of the cactus. And in the background you can see the very large yarn paintings that Mike J was mentioning, and they are obviously for a contemporary art market, and they're very big. Some are as big as 2.5 meters wide. They're huge pieces, whereas the original votives are much smaller and would have been left in caves and so on. So yeah, she was wonderful. She knew a lot about the linked imagery and symbolism, and how you have the sacred deer, you have the sun, you have the shaman, the cactus, and the lizards. All of these symbols seem to interrelate and to transmute into each other. We also had a specialist in Steve Hooper, who has worked on Fijian art for many centuries, not centuries, many decades, not that one. A wonderful man. He's a big fan of kava and yogona, and this is made from a root that's sort of macerated with cold water, and it produces this brown coloured liquid that is then drunk. And it gets you tipsy, apparently. Like after a few cups of this bitter brew, you start to feel like you've had a few glasses of wine, but it's actually, it's a sedative, so it makes you very sleepy. And this is what Queen Elizabeth was served, and what the royal family usually gets served when they visit Fiji. I've heard it's not particularly tasty, so people now mix it with coconut milk or fruit juice to make it more appealing. You can't get this in the UK because it's linked to liver problems, and I think that's because they created a concentrate that then resulted in someone suffering from liver damage, so it was then banned and removed from Holland and Barrett. But in America, on the West Coast, they have kava bars, so you can go and have a drink of kava, or they make you a cocktail with kava in it, so it's become quite trendy. But this does have, originally there were two forms of consuming kava. There was the pre-Christian rites, where you would go to basically a shaman or a witch doctor, and these rites were performed in secret, in private, and you can just about make out in the background a very flat looking dish, and the kava was poured into that dish, and then the shaman would suck it through a straw. And the other version of consuming kava was more communal, and that involved the large circular bowl in the front with the many legs, and then that would be presented in coconut cups to whoever was attending. So they had slightly different ways of consuming kava. This relates to palm wine. We have lots of Kuba cups in the collection that come from what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and these were popular in court culture because they were highly decorative, and they were status objects, And in order to, in the Bouchon dynasty, in order to consolidate your support, you would give people gifts of palm wine. So it kind of generated its own kind of economy or demand for these ornaments and these decorative cups. And we invited Devine Southgate Smith, who's a contemporary artist, British Togolese descent, to work with us on this project. She'd previously worked with our archives and created this orange curving sculpture, and this sort of symbolised the flow of wine between the two mouths of this double-mouthed cup, and also perhaps the flow between this world and the next world, or from contemporary society, the present day to the past. So it's, we also had a section on green tea, because we have lots of tea-related cups and bowls and vessels in our collection. I think also it's important to include to have included tea or coffee in this display, because most people are able to relate to that. They know that it changes their mood, it alters their day. Perhaps they can't easily give up their morning coffee, they get grouchy, they have suffer withdrawal. They understand that it is a form of a drug. So we combined Western ceramics that have been influenced by tea culture with objects that were actually from the Japanese tea ceremony, and we invited a tea ceremony practitioner, Yasuhiro Yamaguchi, to come and place the different utensils. So that was the first. Hopefully this first exhibition got people in the mood and sort of opened their minds to what drugs could mean and how relevant it was to different cultures. So hopefully it gave people a more nuanced understanding of what these special substances are. And then when we moved into the Ayahuasca and Art of the Amazon exhibition. So this was a touring exhibition. As I said before, it was curated by David. We had to change certain things because they couldn't tour from Paris to London. They needed to be rested. Lots of the artifacts in Paris were either quite academic or they were in the French language, and we thought, okay, maybe we should try and replace some of those objects with actual artifacts, and also look for English language equivalents. So those are some of the changes that we did make to the exhibition. Also, there is, within this exhibition, it does explore drug tourism, but it does it in not a particularly overly critical way. I think it was quite forgiving. So it doesn't really describe that drug tourism as being exploitative, whereas I think now if you read in the newspaper about ayahuasca, I think the country like Peru is perhaps thinking twice about inviting all these drug tourists to the country. They're not always welcome, and especially if some people get stuck between worlds, if you like. So they're experiencing a different kind of a transcendental experience, and then they have to somehow come down very quickly and move on back to normal life, and perhaps that transition is too sharp or too much for some people, and they become a little lost. So there are dangers attached to using ayahuasca, and that's possibly why we try to show the use of these special psychoactive substances, in particular community contexts where there is an understanding of what the drug can do, and there are people around you to guide you through that experience. So we also worked with Imperial College and spoke to Christopher Timmerman, who's conducting trials of DMT, which is the active psychoactive substance in ayahuasca. But we didn't really dwell on the dark side of shamanic practices, because that seemed to conflict slightly with the scientific story that we were telling. It was very hard to sort of bring both of those stories together in one paragraph. So this is what the exhibition looked like. When you came in, you saw photographs by David Diaz-Gonzalez, and also we invited two artists who were Shipibo-Konobo women living in a women's community in Lima, and we asked them to come to the Sainsbury Centre and paint one of the murals that they're known for. So we had this really exciting mural within the galleries, and you see this repeating fret-like pattern is the kene, and the kene is this a very special motif that you find within the Shipibo-Konobo community, and it's linked to ayahuasca drinking rituals and use. And these patterns aren't produced while people are under the influence of ayahuasca. They were produced when people have come back from the use of ayahuasca. I think both women were trained as shaman, and undergoing further training, and one of the artists said that her father had specialised in a different plant and had become a sort of very, very knowledgeable in the medical application of a different plant, but she had chosen ayahuasca, and that's what she was being trained to use. And so you can see the pattern being applied to textiles and woven fabric. And these are works by Sara Flores that we have on the cover, who objected strongly to the use of the word drug in connection with ayahuasca. And we also had a virtual reality experience created by Jan Konen. So for 20 minutes, people could experience virtually what it would be like to use ayahuasca. So there were lots of really large insects, snakes writhing around, and you had a series of floating upwards towards the light. It was quite interesting, the conversations we had before we opened this exhibition with health and safety, because there were many pieces in this exhibition that were considered to be high risk. So that with the ayahuasca exhibition, we had to warn people about if they were afraid of insects, or spiders, motion sickness, claustrophobia. We had a room that showed people consuming ayahuasca. When you take ayahuasca, you're often sick, you vomit, so we had to have warnings, you will see people vomiting, so not everyone wants to see that. This display had fragrances, these are used in ayahuasca rituals by shaman, and again we had to warn people in case they were sensitive to strong scents and fragrances. It might have triggered some kind of asthma attack. And we also had a dream machine, a flickering light sculpture, and again we had to warn people in case they were sensitive to, had light sensitive epilepsy. And so there was lots of planning involved so that nobody suffered any injury as a result of these artworks. We also had counselling phone lines in case anyone wanted to talk about problems associated with drug consumption or addiction or drug misuse. So this is in the final room, and here you can see more of the sort of the influence of the Western art market. And here, this is work produced from the 1980s onwards. So the work in here is less abstract and more figurative. You've got works that show the spirits of the plants that sort of protect the guardians of the plants on one side, and on the right you have the Pablo Amaringo works, which are quite bizarre compositions that include, elves, flying saucers, all kinds of unusual pink dolphins. Okay, they exist, but they bring them together in this fantastical world. These are Onanyati sculptures, and then we also had works from Peru and Colombia that showed the types of roots and seeds that were being either brewed or snorted. And there's the dream machine that's people can be very sensitive to. We also had works which showed shamanic tourism, the influence of on Western art. So you've got works by Brian Gysin as well as William Burroughs. Maybe that's more relevant to the Henri Michaux work. And then also contemporary works that looked at digital artworks. But I'll just move quickly to the way, because this section was maybe the most interesting part for us, because we asked this question, we wanted to know how the public would respond. So we had this long hallway, this corridor, and we invited people to write down their responses to the exhibition. And we had so many people responding. And a lot of their comments were fair enough, you know, it was things like, I don't want to use drugs anymore, or to cope with the banality of existence, that's why I'm taking drugs, or to connect to something greater, the universe, nature, experience life's wonders. Some people more cynical, you know, why would you take drugs? Because I'm a middle class student on my gap year. There were really quite fun or quite profound responses we received, but overall they were fairly open-minded and fairly tolerant of the idea that drugs is a part of culture. We've only had one negative comment really, and they said to us, you're not being responsible enough, because we weren't telling people don't do drugs, you'll become immediately addicted and it will ruin your life, because we didn't want to be didactic in that way. We did get negative feedback, but surprisingly very little, which I'm happy to share. So here we had two comments I'm sharing. So one basically said, you know, they talked about their family, and I think this exhibition is fundamentally irresponsible, and there should be, as a matter of course, a section in the original exhibition warning all who see it the dangers of drugs. And we also screened a film called Fantastic Fungi, which was about psilocybin, and a response to that was, this is just propaganda for the use of fungi and psychotropic properties. So I think those were fair comments, but we did list counselling and support services, and we did provide exhibitions about alcohol abuse, heroin addiction, and the use of antidepressants in other parts of the galleries. So I think we did strike a balance. But there you go, I think I better stop talking. Thank you.
I'm afraid there isn't a lot of time for questions, so I'm going to be very harsh and just ask maybe for one question, and then if you have more for Vanessa, we can ask her over the break this afternoon. So does anyone have a question for Vanessa? No? So, there is Brian.
Thank you very much for the description of the exhibition today. I attended the symposium in Paris at the Quai Branly during the exhibition about ayahuasca, and I think I misunderstood what I had heard at that time, because what I understood is that among the Unique people, there was a gender separation between women and men. Ayahuasca rituals were made during the season of hunting. It was for hunters, men going to the forest, and before starting to hunt, they would take ayahuasca in order to deal better with the animals they would hunt, because you never know who is behind the appearance, the costume of the animal. On the other side, the women would make the drawing, the pattern.
Mm.
So the women would do the drawings and the men would do the hunting. But from what I understood of your description, the women were also taking ayahuasca.
Yeah, and we focused on the Shipibo-Konobo people who are different to Kunihuin, or Hunikuin, I always get that wrong. But yes, they take ayahuasca when they're treating or helping other people, or the patient takes ayahuasca. So the patient being treated doesn't always take the ayahuasca. But yeah, both male and female people, both men and women use ayahuasca. And also, I think there are different traditions around the use of ayahuasca, because we also had a Colombian sociologist working with us, and he was talking about how the communities that he lived with and how they would take ayahuasca and how regularly they took it. Every time a particular plant or fruit came into season, they would celebrate and take ayahuasca together as a community. So I think it had different different functions in different societies, and probably still developing in response to Western tourism as well.
So just to repeat, for speakers, the lunch will be in the room next door, and for everyone else, if you want to go either upstairs or outside, and we'll be back. We will be back at maybe 2:20. Yeah, 2:20 here. Welcome back to this afternoon session, which will have probably a slightly different session than we had this morning. And we're going to start with Catherine Bird, who is a Senior Clinical Trials Manager at the Psychoactive Trials Group of King's College, London. After completing a Master's in Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London, Catherine joined the group in 2018 as a research assistant, and since then she has coordinated multiple clinical trials within an NHS research setting, all investigating the use of psychedelics and related compounds as therapies for different health conditions. She's currently completing her PhD exploring the anxiolytic effects of cannabis-based medical products. And she's going to talk about the art and science of psychedelic clinical trials, insights from 6 years of the Psychoactive Trials Group. Thank you, Catherine.
So as Ketty said, my name is Catherine, and I'm the Senior Clinical Trials Manager at a research group at King's College London that focuses on psychedelic therapies for different mental health conditions like depression and PTSD, amongst other things. And what I'd like to do today is basically give you an insight into the creative processes that underlie delivering research and clinical trials, but specifically with psychedelics. A lot of my insights come from like the operational day-to-day running of clinical trials, which sounds boring, but that's kind of the point, because they have the potential to be boring, but if you're willing to engage in a way that I think is creative and artistic, you might find beauty in and amongst the mundane. So, I guess the main message is about the daily act of transforming things into something beautiful, and I think it just comes down to resilience, patience, mutual care, also humor, and I hope you find something in this talk that resonates with you as well. So this is who we are. We are a multidisciplinary team of doctors, psychiatrists, which are doctors, psychologists, psychotherapists, nurses, and academics. And this is kind of a weird picture because we're in a room with shelves that have nothing on it, but this is because we recently, or well now like a year ago, moved into a purpose-built psychedelic research center. And it's truly a joy to work with these people and hear from different perspectives, all with the common goal of delivering psychedelic clinical trials. Essentially what we are trying to understand is not just whether psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, can help with symptoms related to mental ill health, but we're also trying to understand if this time this modern time is a good time for psychedelics in the NHS and in Western medical practices. And that's more of a like systemic thing that is not really measured by clinical trials, but it's a process of trying to see if things might fit, because they tried in the 50s and 60s, and because of various reasons, all of that work got shut down. So we're trying again with a sort of more buttoned up approach, if you might. So these are the people that we, or the organizations that we collaborate with, and I think it's always very important to disclose who you work with, so that, you know, you guys can make a judgment on my biases and the work that we do. But we work with public institutions, so the National Institute for Health Research, which is the NHS's research arm, the Wellcome Trust, NHS England. We work with some charities, and we also work with industry, so life sciences, biotech, pharma, whatever you want to call it. And I don't know whether you think that that is a good thing or not. I'm saying that I'm telling you this in a neutral way, because essentially we're sort of at a stage of late stage capitalism where the sort of more impactful research, i.e. the research that might help bring a new drug, and I say new because obviously psychedelics have been used for time immemorial, but in this context, in psychiatry, they're considered new. To bring a new drug to market and make it available to people who are suffering, the most impactful research is a collaboration between industry and academia, I think. So just to give you a little insight into what we do, this is just an example of what a person might go through if they take part in one of our clinical trials. So we pre-screen them, which means we check whether they meet the criteria for a particular study. That involves a phone call with one of our study team, a video call with a psychiatrist, and these are not just sort of us making an assessment about whether they fit the criteria. It's also an open discussion for the person to meet multiple members of the team and decide whether it's right for them at that point in time. If they seem eligible, we'll allocate them a therapist, create a schedule, and they enter into what's called the preparation phase. So they meet with their assigned therapist leading up to the psilocybin session. And in some studies, we have more than one psilocybin session, not just one, but this is just an example. They have the dose of psilocybin in the hospital, so it's a day dedicated to sitting with their therapist. They may get placebo, they may get a middle dose, they may get a high dose. And then we follow them up for, say, 12 weeks, and in that time they meet with their therapist again to sort of integrate and make sense of the experience. And this is really I guess you could call it a paradigm shift into what is currently available in psychiatry. So there's a lot of creativity that goes into thinking about how we can implement this research, and maybe eventually, you know, if it, you know, we still don't know if it works properly, implement it into existing healthcare systems that are used to a very different model of, say, having psychotherapy without a drug, or taking medication home and taking it every single day. And so if you're familiar with the psychedelic literature, you will have heard this many times before, but I think it's a useful concept to introduce here. People talk about set and setting, where set refers to the internal conditions of the person using a psychedelic, including factors such as mood, attitudes, preparation, personal history, personality, expectations, which is quite an important one because a lot of people have very high expectations of what these drugs can do, motivations for using, and beliefs about themselves and the use of drugs. And that's something that we consider when, say, we find someone who wants to take part in a trial and they seem to be eligible, apart from, like, do they have the disorder that the study is looking at, or actually, I don't like the word disorder. Do they have the condition that we are researching, and do they meet the criteria? We also think about these sort of other social factors and when deciding about whether the clinical trial might be right for them. And that sounds a little bit top-down, but ultimately, we have this process because we've learned through mistakes of letting people into the trial who it may have not been the right time for them to come off their antidepressants. They don't have a good support system, and perhaps their depression gets worse, and we could have avoided that. So these are kind of things that we've learned over time. And then you have to think about, what's going on outside. There's so much media coverage about psychedelics these days, and that's what I was saying about people coming into the trials with extremely high expectations of it just sort of working and it being magical, which would be lovely. And psychedelics can be magical, but they're not always. So it's a lot of work kind of preparing people for what may not be an experience that they're expecting. And then moving on to setting. Setting broadly refers to the physical and social environment in which the drugs are being taken. And this is a photo of the clinical research facility where for the first 5 years we were doing the psychedelic research. Obviously not in this room, but this is what the room looks like normally. And so we had to, this is kind of what I was saying about having to work within a system to change it, you have to kind of work with what you've got. So what we would do is, in order to make the room comfortable, because psychedelics can make you, as you know, more sensitive to your surroundings, we would dress up the room. And I took a little video for you to show you exactly what this involved. And when I first started, I was 24 years old, I had a lot of energy and I was very passionate, and I would do this at least once a week. And, you'd come to work at 8 a.m. and you would dress up the room so that when the participant arrived, they had no idea what it looked like before. And, I'm very grateful that I don't have to do that anymore, but that in itself is sort of an act of care. And, it was very good for my physical strength. And this is what it tends to look like afterwards. It's not exactly the Ritz-Carlton, but it is a nicer place than a clinical environment to be taking psychedelics. And, it's different. Like when we first started doing this, a lot of the staff would kind of laugh at us, at the hippies, like bringing their fake plants to the hospital. But also a lot of people were curious, and we're now at a stage where, in collaboration with Compass Pathways, which is a life sciences company, developing, psilocybin therapy, along with South London MOSI, which is NHS Trust, and King's College, we have our own purpose-built psychedelic research center. And I saw a meme the other day that was like, why can't we get rid of mental health grey? Which we obviously haven't been able to escape here. But, we have a bit of curtain action. We have these blue lights that actually you can change to whatever color you want. So it's really a joy to work there, and it's good vibes. So this is where we work now, but it took us 5 years to get to this point. And it's also an interim unit, so we only have tenure for 5 years, which means afterwards they could take it back, the NHS might take it back. And it's not necessarily the optimal place, because we can still keep thinking about what might be better than this. And the head of our group, James Rucker, always talks about the dream of having a psychedelic dosing center, if all of this were to be approved and we were able to do this work in the NHS. At the Royal Bethlehem Hospital in South London, there's 200 acres of green space, and how amazing would it be to be able to do this work there. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about bureaucracy, and this is Keeks. She's our lead nurse, and you can see she's got like two patient folders. She has blood forms, she has like biological samples that she needs to send off. Everything in clinical trials is still done on paper, despite 2025. And there's a lot of regulatory oversight, and that's for good reason, because there's been a lot of atrocities that have happened in research, like the thalidomide tragedy, where drugs aren't tested properly and a lot of people get harmed, but it also, on a day-to-day basis, can feel like it's gone way too far. And there's a lot of paper pushing, and you have to enter the data that you've written down into the computer, and then someone else has to come and check it every month and check that what you've written is the same that's in the database, and it's like this whole thing. And a lot of people have written about the rise of this kind of form filling out in academia. This guy says, "For some years now it has become increasingly apparent to me that we are sleepwalking into a disaster. We are losing sight of the academic mission, to think, to inquire, to design and perform new research, to innovate, to teach and communicate our findings for the purpose of societal improvement. There are many reasons why this has occurred over just a quarter of a century, but a key contributor has been the corporatization of academic institutions. In principle, there's nothing wrong with making universities strong businesses, incorporating within them systems that make them financially secure, and endowing them with strong governance. However, a key problem has been that instead of facilitating academic work, these systems have created obstacles to performing the core mission. And there was a piece of art that was done by Rachel Crowther, and it was in the gallery Ginny on Frederick, and she was kind of talking about the closure of the Queen's Road Day Center, which was a community center for adults with learning disabilities. And she said, in this write-up in Editorial Magazine, they say, in Qualified to Care, the artist addresses how we understand care as an action, industry, and necessity. Care is examined in a broad spectrum, looking at what it means to care for something or someone, and what is determined to be deserving of care by a given distributor. The frontline workers who deliver support to those in need are hemmed in, hampered by the need for quantifiable feedback and the creation of data sets. The endless cycle of report writing is a necessary evil in order to maintain funding for programs and projects, but cannot happen without billable working hours being devoted to it. As a result, care sector workers are often forced to work beyond their allotted hours to deliver the level of support necessary. So this is not exactly applicable because in research you have to collect data and quantify things. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that in and amongst all this bureaucracy, it's sometimes quite hard to maintain the level of passion or care that you might have wanted to have in the first place. And how do I deal with it? Well, I'm quite at home at hospitals, but hospitals don't make very many people comfortable. But I think if you look closely, there's a lot of very beautiful things to be seen in a hospital. And my colleague and I, Tim, have a shared album where we upload cute things that we see on a daily basis. This one, my Filipino brother Angelo has on his computer. Be kind, work hard, stay humble, smile often, be honest, travel when possible, never stop learning, and be thankful always, and give love. And on the end there's Angelina, who doesn't work with us anymore, but when they decided to do construction outside of her window, she stuck pictures of the sky outside to be reminded. And this is just kind of, I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you look closely, you will find beauty, even in amongst all the bullshit. And you know, ultimately that's also what we're asking our participants to do when you're sort of stuck in depression and it's noisy and there's rumination and it's hard to see the beauty. Sometimes there's like a little, you just look, there's like a little nugget of gold in there. And this is what I do in order to make things kawaii and cute. This is one of our drug boxes, and then that's my office, not pictured as a massive stain on the ceiling. But you know, I try my best to make my environment what I want to see. And this is actually a really beautiful chapel that sits in the hospital. I don't know if my colleagues here even know that it exists. Katie's shaking her head. But it's literally like off the side to the corridor, and sometimes when I feel a bit overwhelmed, I go sit in there. And all of this, I guess, is about creating space. And it's about creating space to find what you need, but also creating space to work with your colleagues in a respectful way. So over time, and all of these processes that we put in place have actually come about when something's gone wrong. So it's also about being able to, you know, respond when something happens and put in practices to make sure it doesn't happen again. So we meet every week to discuss our ongoing cases and make shared decisions. And the emphasis is on shared decisions because if you don't do that and something does go wrong, like one person is then holds the whole blame. We have group supervision every 6 weeks, which is kind of like family therapy, which sounds like hell to some people doing family therapy with your colleagues. But we meet with a systemic psychotherapist who has the most chef's kiss outfits. She's amazing. But she has a passion for anti-oppressive and anti-stigmatizing practices. But essentially, she just provides us the space to talk through conflict. If we have a participant case that maybe touched us deeply, we can discuss it there. And also to make a space where we can talk about the vision and the direction of the research team. And then we also have a psychedelic integration group, which is a public-facing group, and in the interest of safety and keeping, helping people understand difficult psychedelic experiences. That is something that our lead therapist, Liam, offers. wrong computer. And so what is, like, you know, what's the point of all of this? Well, even if psychedelics don't get approved, or the big trials that we're doing now don't show that it helps for whatever condition, and even though a lot of people actually don't respond to the treatment, a lot of people get a placebo, there's a lot of disappointment, there's a lot of, you know, you have to be realistic about these things. But even if it doesn't come to fruition in the way that some might hope, there are still being, you know, moments along the way that make it worthwhile. And I just want to share, with the permission of some of our participants, creative acts that have taken place after a psychedelic dosing session. So this participant is in our psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. So she tried multiple antidepressants, they hadn't worked for her, and she said, "My therapeutic journey has lifted my mood, boosted my energy, and rekindled my creativity. I'm so grateful to the Trial Center team for their kindness and compassion. Making bespoke earrings for them felt like a natural and joyful way to say thank you." Yeah, she made me ones that were like black metal balls, which I thought was very perceptive of her. And this music that I'm going to play for you is from a participant in the MDMA trial we did for post-traumatic stress disorder. He'd been DJing since he was 16, and he started producing music in 2019. And he said that since the trial, he had been a lot more exploratory with his music, and he feels more able to draw on his emotions and the deeper side of things. So the first track, he says, is inspired by his time on the MDMA trial, and it's much more what he wanted to produce back then but wasn't able to, but it still draws on like the heavier, darker techno that he used to make. I hope this works.
His mind is miles away.
The second track, he said, he wanted to make something with more musical chord-based sounds, but he'd always been scared and reluctant to step into that style. But the sense of creativity that came afterwards gave him the confidence to do so, and he said this track helps put him back in the MDMA.
I am free. The sun will shine on me, shine on me.
Yeah, so that's all I have to say. Thank you so much. I hope you learned something, and sorry I didn't mention Mishaux or Mescaline once.
So the next speaker is Matthew Butler, who works with Catherine, in fact. Matthew is a specialist registrar in psychiatry and a doctoral clinical research fellow. He has several years' experience working as a study doctor on clinical trials of psychedelics for a range of neuropsychiatric disorders. And he's currently based, as I said, with Catherine at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience of King's College, and undertaking a neural imaging study which is funded by the Wellcome Trust of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy in functional neurological disorder. So thank you, Matthew.
Thanks, Ketty. I'm going to presume you can all hear me through the microphone. Disclosure that I am a psychiatrist. I'm going to duck behind the computer and get tomato thrown at me. But I'm also an academic. I'm going to give you a sort of surface level view from a kind of clinician scientist point of view about psychedelics and the way that they might be acting on the brain in people with different mental disorder or distress, and thinking about this in kind of quite a trans-diagnostic way. I'm actually going to start off with a brief foray into a kind of neuroscience of consciousness. So I'm going to fully explain the mysteries of consciousness to you in the next 5 minutes. I'm going to do this in order to set up a kind of conceptual approach to how we might think about the effects of psychedelics on the brain, both in sort of healthy people, but also in people with mental disorders. Like I said, it's going to be quite conceptual. And I'm going to start off with with an example about that teaches about something called predictive processing, which some of you may or may not be aware. So this is the idea that we are not passive receivers of sensory information from the world. In fact, there's an active process of construction of reality that the brain sort of produces, and that forms our conscious experience. And we do this by making predictions or best guesses about the environment in which we're part of. I'll discuss in which ways these predictions can take place, but I think a good example to think about this is visual perception. So we live in a world in which there are shadows cast by the sun, cast by light. Obviously, when things are in shadow, they look darker than, well, they are darker than they would be if they were in light. And so our visual system in the brain automatically corrects for this phenomenon. So I think if I was to ask many of you, particularly if you haven't seen this before, which of these squares is lighter out of the A and B, you would say B, and I would say B, despite having seen this illusion many times. Whereas in fact they're exactly the same colour. So the wavelength of light that is coming from those two squares is exactly the same. But I hope I can assume that for all of you, B looks lighter than A, despite showing you that it isn't. And that's because we have deep-seated predictions or prior beliefs that objects are darker than they appear when they're in shadow, and so our brain corrects for this. So it illustrates that what we're seeing is not actually a true representation of the world, it is partly constructed by our minds. And this is an example of how we use a mixture of top-down and bottom-up sort of influences when we're constructing our experience. So bottom-up processing is the simple kind of sensory perceptions that we have, so the wavelengths of light sort of hitting our retina and going to the occipital cortex in the back of the brain. But then we process these images, and the brain does that through kind of higher, more evolved cortical sort of evolutionary newer parts of the brain in some circumstances, but using predictions about the world to modify these perceptions, and that's what forms our conscious experience. So it's this admixture of the kind of bottom-up sensory processing and the top-down predictions, and the brain then updates the predictions based on the sensory information. So if we expect to see something that then doesn't arise, we might get a sense of initial surprise, but then the brain sort of, in most cases, will correct for it. So it's sort of making an average of the two, of the prediction and the perception information. This is a really cool idea. I don't think it's actually as novel as some neuroscientists would have you think. Well, I mean, I'm not saying I've ever read Kant in much detail, but I certainly know about his ideas that, well, he sort of, I suppose, to Western philosophy anyway, introduced the idea that there is this active part of the brain constructing reality through the admixture of a priori conceptions and categories of knowledge or categories of knowing, which help to produce our experience. And he famously sort of split the world in between the noumenal world, which is the world that is, and the phenomenal world, i.e. the world that we perceive it, and with the sort of implication that these are different things. So modern neuroscience has taken this to sort of a logical next step, I suppose, by suggesting that actually our experience of the world is a constructed reality. So Anil Sethi is a sort of leading neuroscientist in the field of consciousness, suggested that we live in a controlled hallucination, so suggesting that our experience is entirely constructed by the brain and only scaffolded or modified by our sensory perceptions. So I'm mainly focused here on kind of visual perceptions and the effect of predictive processing on this, but also there are other ways in which we perceive aspects of our existence that's not just perceiving the outside world. So you can think of something called proprioception, which you may be aware of is our sense of our body in space. So if I move my arm up, I get a signal to say that my arm is now held up. So that's a proprioceptive signal coming from the muscles and the joints. And so that is part of the feedback, and again, which predictive processing sort of aspects are likely to be involved. So we're actively predicting where a body is in space, and we're getting confirmatory signals to come back to show us that that is indeed the case. And we also have interoceptive processes, which are essentially our bodily state processes. So, you know, are we hungry? Do we need to go to the toilet? Are we angry, sad? So emotional perceptions. And these are all aspects of our consciousness, which again will be partly constructed if you see it through the predictive processing model. And we know, for example, things like mood disorders, let's say someone's depressed or low in mood, that the depression or the low mood can sort of colour experiences. It can lead to negative biases, which you can see that in the predictive processing model as the brain making negative predictions about itself or about the world. And just a brief phrase, I presume I'm talking to people a lot more qualified than me about this. I read Gone Brick when I was a medical student, but the idea of the beholder's share in art, I think, is a really nice example of how the sort of predictive processing model can be applied to sort of our perceptual experiences. So the idea that when we engage with a piece of artwork, of course, we bring a lot of ourselves in a sort of often unconscious manner to our sort of perception of what the piece of art is. And a really sort of important book for me that I read as an undergraduate that I think was partly responsible for leading me to where I am now was a book by Eric Kandel, who's a Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist, who talks about the predictive processing model as applied to the engagement with art, particularly kind of successionism and impressionism. So I recommend that if any of you are interested in the kind of neuroscience of art, I suppose. So after that sort of full explanation of consciousness, I'm going to talk a bit about psychedelics, and I hope that the ideas that I've introduced will make sense when I'm talking about, at a conceptual level, how we think psychedelics might be working. So this is a picture of a brain, of course. This is a PET scan of a brain. And what happens here is that we are showing where a particular receptor for a neurotransmitter, so a signaling chemical in the brain called serotonin, and this is a serotonin 2A receptor, so where it's distributed in the brain. And you can see, hopefully from the images, that so the darker the red, I suppose, the more highly densely expressed the receptor is. You can see that it goes across the brain, this serotonin 2A receptor, but particularly in areas of the front of the brain, so the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, and at the bit where the temporal lobe joins the parietal lobe, which is sort of the middle back of the brain there. So it's expressed in regions which, again, are evolutionarily newer. It's expressed in the cortex of the brain, so it's not really involved with sort of deeper, older processes like, for example, motor movement. You can see there's almost no expression on the cerebellum, which is the little brain at the bottom. It's coloured in blue there. And psychedelics are principally psilocybin, which is what I'm sort of mainly experiencing using, affect the serotonin 2A receptor. So if we think about psilocybin, which comes from magic mushrooms, the psilocybin molecule is dephosphorylated into something called psilocin, which looks quite a lot like serotonin and strongly binds to the serotonin 2A receptors. And the way that neurons work is that you have bridges between them. So you have an impulse travelling down the neuron on the left-hand side, and then you get release of chemicals, of neurotransmitters, for example, serotonin, and then you get they bind to receptors on the postsynaptic, so the one on the right-hand side neuron, and that signals that one to propagate the signal further. With drugs, like psychedelics, you can sort of hijack that system, and so what psychedelics do is they bind to the 2A receptor on the postsynaptic, so in the further down neuron, and that stimulates it, even though there isn't perhaps more serotonin being released into the synapse. And the way that it does this is different than serotonin. It binds slightly differently, so it leads to different patterns of excitation of the neurons, which can be correlated with a sort of phenomenological experience. And this is just obviously another picture of the brain, so this is another PET image, and we can see, so again in red you have a sort of chemical binding to the 2A receptors, and then on the right hand side this is someone who's taken psilocybin, and what you can see is that the binder, the tracer, gets pushed out of the way, so it no longer binds to the serotonin 2A receptors because there is psilocybin or psilocin binding to those receptors, which means that it's a very, very strong and potent binder to the serotonin 2A receptor. So that's sort of the basic neuroscience done. So what does this do to the brain? So this is quite a famous sort of seminal image from psychedelic neuroscience literature. So on the left-hand side, we have a very, very sort of conceptual representation of the brain at rest. If you can imagine that the outside circle, there are little blobs, and each blob is a particular node or particular area or region of the brain. And the lines that are drawn between them, these are the connections between these areas. So in the brain at rest, whenever we're doing anything, there's constant crosstalk between regions. But actually there are certain networks which are very, very strongly sort of related to each other. And so there are regions of the brain that are constantly talking to each other at rest normally. And these regions might not be cross-talking with other regions at rest or a normal kind of consciousness. If you give someone a psychedelic, which is represented on the left-hand side circle, you get an enormous increase in the crosstalk between different regions of the brain. So different nodes of the brain are talking to each other in different ways, that you don't get in normal resting consciousness. And actually how it does this is because it subtly decreases blood flow in parts of these nodes through the signaling, and so you get what's called desegregation of networks. So the networks that are usually quite tightly separated from each other become less siloed. And again, I think that nicely correlates with the sort of phenomenological experience of a psychedelic, in which there is sort of this blowing open of experience, perhaps sort of creativity in the sense of insights or sort of novel methods or sort of insights or realizations of thinking. So it's possible that if you get this sort of desegregation, this sort of increasing entropy, this sort of blowing up of the brain, that it might influence the predictive processing networks. So if we're normally thinking about the brain as making predictions, it's pick these up through habit, and it's sort of, they're quite reliably created. If we can think of something that can disrupt this process, something like psychedelics, which completely blow open the networks in the brain, and perhaps we are reducing the influence of these top-down predictions and increasing the weight of the bottom-up sort of information in our brain. So in a sort of very, very simplistic crude metaphor, we could be giving a bit of a sort of reset, or someone once described it a bit like shaking a snow globe and sort of letting everything sort of break open and then go back together. And this has been described in the psychedelic literature as the rebus model, so the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics model. There are some criticisms of this model, and it is limited like all models, but I think it's a useful way of thinking about the neuroscience of psychedelics. And why might it be useful? Well, it might help us to explain the kind of cross-diagnostic or trans-diagnostic potential of psychedelics. We've talked a bit about research in depression, but there are also been research in things like PTSD, anorexia, OCD, different forms of anxiety, existential distress in people with terminal illnesses. And what these disorders may share between them, the commonality may be that there is these entrenched belief systems, or you might say sort of incorrect priors or over-precise priors about the self, or about the body, or about the outside world. And it may be that shaking up these negative predictions or these incorrect predictions could underlie some of the therapeutic effect for psychedelics. And some of the work that I'm doing in something called functional neurological disorders, which is neurological symptoms which, for want of a better phrase, have a kind of psychological cause. It may be that the brain is making incorrect predictions about the body, and when we're giving people with this disorder of psychedelic, we're shaking up those predictions. So how might we measure how this works? So very, very briefly, it's very, very difficult. I'll touch on it at the very end of the presentation, but there is, of course, this ineffability about the psychedelic experience. So when we run these studies, we do ask people about, how did they find the experience, and we tend to use different scales. This one that I'm showing here is called the Altered State of Consciousness scale, where there are different domains of, I suppose, disruptions or alterations to consciousness. And we can see a relatively dose-dependent effect for these psychedelic drugs, so they're not in all domains, where people get disruptions to their normal waking consciousness. And this can be sort of a massive range of phenomena. We've talked a lot about sort of visual effects, but also sort of transcendental experiences, synesthesia experiences, time perception alterations, ego dissolution or feeling of disembodiment. And there are many criticisms about the sort of I suppose the veracity of these concepts or these dimensions, but they may help explain some of the reasons why psychedelics work. But again, I'll touch on again some of the difficulties in doing that at the end of the presentation. These are just some of the ways in which I think that psychedelics might be effective for people with mental health disorders, and this is a sort of relatively non-scientific sort of attempt by me to explain some of the phenomena that we see in our clinical trials of psychedelics that may be responsible for improvement. So things like sets of connection or unity or transcendent sort of connection to the universe or to spiritual aspects. You see that in some people. Sometimes there are sort of insights about the self, a realignment of the self to the disorder or to the people around them, or a reassessment of relationships, which can be quite conscious, but also there can be sometimes just a sense of unconscious processing that somehow the psychedelics have shifted some sort of belief in the person that was relatively unshakable in the past. And this, again, may go back to this idea of alterations in predictive processing. So I'm just going to finish very briefly on just some of the challenges faced by psychedelic research. I'm going to mainly focus on the fact that it's very difficult to sort of rigorously disambiguate the effects of the drug from placebo, but also the way that we design psychedelic trials in the modern era is very, very similar to sort of standard drug trials. And of course you have the problem in psychedelics that you generally know whether or not you've been allocated to the treatment rather than the placebo arm. And so this leads to what's called a functional unblinding, where people know if they've been allocated to the sort of novel, sexy psychedelic arm, or whether they've just been in the bog standard, disappointing, mundane placebo. And this leads to real problems in interpreting the research. I just wanted to very quickly say that actually sometimes disambiguating whether people have had a psychedelic experience is more complicated. There are certainly grey areas. This is one of my favourite ever studies, which was basically a completely placebo study where they told people that they were having an active psychedelic drug. These are healthy people. Put them in a room which they sort of dressed up in a sort of slightly psychedelia sort of artwork, put some psychedelic music on, and there was a stooge in there in which they'd given eye drops to dilate the pupils, whose job was to go around saying, "Whoa, isn't this amazing?" And then they asked people afterwards whether or not they had a psychedelic experience, and some people said that they did. And the graph on the right shows that there were quite a lot of people who actually didn't report psychedelic experiences, but some people reported experiences equivalent to a massive recreational dose of LSD. So people are complicated. This is just to illustrate the kind of the real world effects, though, of the sort of functional unblinding that we have in studies. So, for very brief, sort of crudely, in a clinical trial, you have the placebo arm versus the active treatment arm. And people get randomly allocated, so sometimes on a 50-50 basis, as whether they're getting the drug or the placebo. And this is the basis for many clinical trials of psychedelics these days. So what you get with psychedelics is this functional unblinding. People really want to have a psychedelic because they've heard how great it is, and they really don't want to have the placebo. So usually we're looking at the differences between the drug effects and the placebo effects, which you can see on the left-hand side. In the high expectancy conditions, i.e. where people really want the drug and don't want placebo, you get a inflation of the treatment effect because you get more placebo effect in people who get the drug, and you get less placebo effect in people who don't get the drug. So you lead to a large inflation between the groups, so people get more better than they should do in the active group, and they don't get as well as they should do in the placebo group. So this makes our drugs look better than they actually are. There's been many suggestions about how to get around that, but I think that there hasn't been anything sort of properly suggested yet, which I think would get around it. Use of active placebos, use of virtual reality placebo groups, that sort of thing. Why might this happen? Well, I think it's because, again, humans are complex, situated beings. We're not brains in vats. We're not disembodied heads. Any sort of response to treatment or response to anything, it takes place in a sort of connected experience, and this is something that influences the placebo effect. And there's been some really nice literature on the different factors of what the influence placebo response. So I think kind of the I suppose the tabloid version of placebo response is that you take a sugar pill and you get better, but actually it's a completely societal, all the way down to the receptor level of response that people have that's based on cultural factors, their own susceptibility, their genetics, their previous experiences, their own kind of conscious and unconscious expectancies, and also the characteristic of their disorder or their illness. And so what we're seeing in the highlighted boxes is perhaps the factors that are really heightened in psychedelic trials that might mean that we're actually talking about super placebos, or perhaps that psychedelics are simply medications that modify the same aspects as placebo response. And that might be the case. If it is, I suppose it's up to society to decide whether or not that's acceptable. In my opinion, it would be. So it's possible that in psychedelic trials what we're seeing is a sort of the enactment of a kind of super placebo. And this perhaps probably has quite deep evolutionary underpinnings. So this is artwork from Indigenous Australia. And you can see that there's a healer or a shaman in the middle there, sort of laying his hands on a sick person, and there's a sort of procession of people around there contributing to the healing ritual. And I don't think that is actually as dissimilar as we think it would be between sort of a ward round in a hospital or a psychedelic treatment, particularly when there's psychedelic therapy offered alongside it. Just to finish on as well, talking about challenges facing when we're studying psychedelics. So I talked about this ineffability. I wonder whether or not we'll ever be able to truly understand mechanistically what is going on with psychedelics. And again, it's another question about whether or not that's important. I was recently reading the work by another Henri Bergson, apologies for my accent, who talked don't think it had much to do with psychedelics, although it did influence Aldous Huxley. He is mentioned in Doors of Perception. But he talks about the difference between kind of symbolic rational thinking, which of course is the bedrock of science, which requires the use of symbols, language, in order to understand things, and then intuition, which he called the sort of non-symbolic way of understanding. And this is, for him, the way to truly get to the sense of something, to truly know something. But it's also, because it doesn't involve symbols, it's very unshareable, it's very unique and sort of individual. I wonder whether some aspects of the psychedelic experience are like this, that we might not ever be able to truly access them through sort of systems of knowing like science. But again, the question is, do we accept that? Do we need to know, or does it matter more that people are, offer the opportunity to get better from their mental disorders? Thanks everyone for listening.
So we are coming now to the last talk of the day. I'm glad that you are still here with us until the end. And we're going to we're going to hear the talk of Franck Lebovici, who is responsible for the Henri Michaux archive in Paris, and whom with Mescaline Drawings and Michael Maison, I'm not sure I pronounced it correctly, but he has been working on the catalogue raisonné of Henri Michaux since 2001. An artist himself, even though he doesn't like us to sort of say it, but his book Henri Michaux, Voir une enquête, published in 2014, is an introduction to the catalogue raisonné and its methodological problems. And this afternoon he's going to talk about what could shamanic ritual drawings teach us about Henri Michaux's Mescaline Drawings. Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you, Ketty, and thank you, the Courtauld, for organizing this. As I'm the last one on this long day, I try to be not too long. And also, I will change, of course, slightly the presentation I plan to do in order to integrate different bits of the previous contribution of the day. And I'd like to start with the reference to the book by Daston and Gallison about objectivity, because I think it's a nice way to go back to the Mescaline Drawings by Mishaux. In their book, Daston and Gallison were saying one thing, that objectivity is a historical notion and has its own history. So what people understood by objectivity in the 17th century, it was different from what people from the 19th century understood, was different from people from the 20th century and from the 21st century. So the notion, the definition of objectivity is being transformed through years, and also through the different scientific methodology we are using. So just to give you one example, it's very different understanding of objectivity when you use a mechanical instrument to record, and when you have to interpret an image like X-ray radio, or like the brain image that was shown this afternoon. Because you have color coding, for instance, and you have symbolic convention, and this is not the same objectivity than when you have a seismographic, let's say, or structural patterns. So in this context, you have to remember that in the 50s, there was no brain imagery. So in order to provide detailed accounts of these experiments of mescaline or LSD or hashish or psilocybin on brain, some neuropsychiatrists considered that poets and painters might be good candidates to produce accounts by drawings or by textual description. And Mishaux was selected in this context. The idea was to produce a new standard of representation, a new calibration to represent alteration of consciousness because once again there was no brain imagery. So the idea of the starting point of the experiment by Michaux was to start from personal experience that would be rooted in an I, moi, je, and, and to produce an image that could be shared publicly and discussed publicly, which is something that you cannot do when you have a personal experience. It's very difficult to say, no, you did not experience this. Well, if I say I experienced that, you have to believe me. So when you produce a public image or public textual account, then you can debate about it. And the goal of Michaux was to produce this shareable standard of representation. Gibbon says that when Michaux was preparing his experiment, he would very conscientiously get prepared by following few instructions. Like the day before, he would eat very lightly, he would drink only water, and during the experiment, he would have either tea or very sweet water. He would close the windows. He would surround himself with images of sculptures. He would put on some music in order to produce a context of suggestion. If his experiments took place mainly at home, strictly speaking, they were made possible only by direct links with medical research institutions, like psychiatry hospital, like the Sainte-Anne Hospital, with pharmaceutical laboratories like Sandoz, with Museum of Natural History, directed by Roger Heim, who produced the psilocybin, etc. And although Michaux' perspective is of knowledge production, his book Knowledge by the Abyss starts with drugs bore us with their paradise, let them give us a bit of knowledge instead. He nevertheless that the synthetic mescaline comes from peyote, and thus this molecular extraction has a cultural cost. Just as each piece of new knowledge destroys older ones, the development of modern sciences destroy as its counterpart traditional knowledge. I will quote a little fragment that I translated myself, so excuse me for my broken English. Western man came back of a completely different type, without arms this time, but still an adventurer, greedy no longer for gold or the propagation of his religion, but for science now, his new big thing. Still excited, still profanatory, but in a different way. A stranger to piety, who dragged impiety along with him, an outsider who, expecting nothing but profane, will meet nothing but profane. On the desanctified field, peyote would have to serve. And he considered these new adventurers like, it was quoted this morning, journalists invited to the crucifixion. So, but also, although he has a fairly detailed knowledge of shamanic rituals, he does not seek in his experiences to recreate conditions similar to those of indigenous peoples. Today, I would like to draw a broad comparison between Michaux' experimental device and with certain Amazonian shamanic rituals, because a better understanding of what Michaux' experiments are not might help us to better describe, by contrast, what they are. I should say to start that I'm not a specialist at all about these rituals. My knowledge comes mainly from readings by anthropologists like Els Lagroux, Patrick Dezay, or Anne-Christine Taylor, who spent decades studying those rituals. And also, although Michaux read mainly about the Huichol and the Tarahumaras in Mexico, I would take examples more from the Unicuin and their use of ayahuasca, because the kind of drawing and the status of the drawings they are producing could be a lot of help for us. So I will ask mainly 3 questions during my talk. First is, why, when, and how do the Unicuin take ayahuasca? And we will compare with Michaux. Second, the status of the drawing among the ayahuasca. And third, the connection between the way to account first-person experience with the drawings. So I will try to go as fast as possible, Katie, to say it very broadly. And I understood from this morning that there is no one true version of what a ritual is among the Unicuin, because it changed a lot through centuries, and not even centuries, but through years, and through situation, and through parts of the area you're studying. So I'm providing just one version, the one I read in books. So first, it's not enough to take ayahuasca to have visions, even if you listen to the right music. For the Unicuin, at least for a long time, ayahuasca was taken collectively, almost collectively, and was reserved to the hunters under the responsibility of a preparer, of a shaman, who accompanies them with chants. The ritual was carried out in the village or in the forest, standing on spears. Things are changing today with ayahuasca tourism. In contrast, we could say that Michaux is the only one to take drugs in his apartment, so it's not a collective thing. And even though for the first experiment there were 2 other people, Jean Paulhan and Edith Boissonnat, they were, from their account, they were mostly by themselves. They were staying alone. And nobody was playing the role of the shaman guiding the others. Why are those rituals linked to hunting? The context, the framing is, let's say, animistic cosmology, which means that you never know when you are hunting an animal who you're facing with, who you're dealing with, who behind the appearance, behind the costume, behind the disguise of the form of this animal is hidden, which entity. And ayahuasca is giving you a channel of communication. And that is very important because as a hunter, you consider the animal as a prey, but on the reverse, the entity considers you as a prey. So in order to not becoming a total prey, you have to negotiate with the entity that is behind the disguise of the animal. And ayahuasca is let's say, a tool of diplomacy, because you can have access to the entity and you can start to learn from the identity of the spirit. When taking ayahuasca, 3 elements are decisive: vomiting, fright, and visions. The hunter's fear in the face of the predator is called date, and it's linked to a state of metamorphosis. In front of the spirit, the hunter becomes the game. So to control date, to control the fear, one develops messe, the vigilance, awareness. And you cleanse your date, your fear, by vomiting. It's a sort of therapy, but not out of a psychological state. It's also a pedagogy, educating young people to be afraid so that they learn to stand firm.
The Ashwar people have the same pedagogy of fear control. So there's a search for the fear. It was a good session. We were very afraid. And vomiting, because it also helps you to expel the fear, which means to expel the images you are encountering during the session, during the ritual. On the other side, on the Michaux side, he talks about nausea, but not as brutal as vomiting. And above all, the nausea, which are of medicinal nature, is perceived as a nuisance, not as something to look for. And the fear is mostly about the loss of control, not about a bad encounter. What if I cannot come back to a normal state? However, we need to qualify this because Michaux is well aware that the experiment he's conducting will only produce interesting results if he ventures outside of his comfort zone. So risk-taking is necessary. The fright is accepted as the price to pay. Let's say that with the Unikuin, fear is something to be mastered or tamed in order to reach a state of trance, and that's maybe where peyote and mescaline can meet each other. At the moment of the encounter with the spirits, the ornaments, the patterns, the entity wears indicate the intention of the speeches and are therefore to be decoded. I don't think that there is anything to decode as symbolic pattern in Michaux drawings, although that in his book, Miserable Miracle, he makes an index of the different strokes or lines he will produce. In other words, the spirits of the speeches, the bodily motif they display can have a figurative aspect, which is called dami, and a non-figurative aspect, which is called kene. Contrary to our way of thinking, the figurative dami is less realistic because it's a decoy of the animals. The abstract kene, the abstract pattern, on the other hand, goes to the heart of things. The abstract has a relationship with reality, while the figurative image is always an illusion. What happens is a non-human intention to tell us something, but it's never clear. We are far away from the Western model where the image informs us, gives us information. So the Unikuin people shun ecstatic forms. While the image may be beautiful, it's dangerous because you will forget to come back and forget your condition as a human being. We have to come back. During his experiment, Michaux did not really report any encounters with spirits. There were no deceptive appearance, but strangely enough, while it was totally unexpected, he mentioned at some point that there were what he called presence that should not be there. And I will move now to the second part, which is the link between the drawings and the visionary experience. Among the Unikuin, at least in the version I've read, it's a woman who produced the drawings. Labyrinthine, complex drawings that cover large surfaces, and it's mainly the men who take ayahuasca. The women's drawings, therefore, enter into the men's vision, and not the other way around. So the women produce the drawing, the men look at the drawing, and these drawings are used as the basis to produce a vision during the ayahuasca rituals. And the drawing traces are used as a path to follow, let's say as a map, in order not to get lost. just as the shaman is guiding the group by chanting during the ritual. Michaux drawings are not gendered because it's both the draughtman and the person who takes the drug. And at first, we would not consider that his drawings are a map to circulate and not to get lost. However, I think we could once again qualify this. Is writing that in the ocean of mescaline, one is totally shaken by everything, the mark on the sheet of paper works as an anchor in order to make choices and to stabilize the vision and to make things more under control. I'm quoting, although without any support in inner visions, eyes closed, the product is even more extraordinary, surely more singular, more bewildering, but contradictory, versatile, ungovernable. With the sign, so one is drawing, you tame it, you hold on to it. So it's important to choose the right place to bring it together. So it's only the drawing is not a map in itself of another universe where entities are living, but it's a system of control or your own navigation system. The drawings in the unicorns are also a trap to capture the spirits and to force them, in a way, to interact and to negotiate. With Michaux' side, the criterion is not, it's different with the unicorn, is not to represent as correctly as possible the patterns that were seen during the visions, because, as he says, you don't see clearly anything. So the criterion is not is a reproduction correct. His criterion to say that a drawing is relevant is rooted in the body experience, which is to say, because the drawings were made after the experiment and not during, if he's able to reenact the mescaline vibration he felt during the experiment, then the drawing will be considered as a success, because there will be this memory of the body, this somatic memory, which will be reenacted by holding the pen and the vibration. And then the disaggregation experience will be produced on the sheet of paper. I'm quoting again, never, or I'm very much mistaken, has anyone actually seen objects or monuments in the mescaline visions. Made up of undulating lines, agitated points, spaced out, not forming a block, they have never been seen, but always been interpreted. It is on dots, on moving dots, that we have accepted to recognize an object or worse. It is on spidery wefts, less than spidery. Vision of mountains, which could also be tapered, picks or enormous knives, or triangles with sharps, thin points pointing upwards. This was my first vision. Last part, between account of experience and drawings. Among the unicorns, I would say there are two types of stories. You have the myth, and you have the first-person accounts of experience. Myths are stories in which something happens, but they lack physical description of the protagonist and their environments. Those ones are not singled out by a proper name. They are only taxon of species. The jaguar, the tapir, the man. In myth, implausible, counterintuitive, and interspecies events occur. A penis grows disproportionately long. Rat teach women how to give birth. And you have another kind of stories, which are accounts of experiences of encounters with non-human beings, who are to be distinguished from myths. These accounts are told in the first person by someone who assumes to be the author, and we take him at his word, or half-heartedly, or not at all. The creatures encountered may be present in this account, but nothing happens, apart from the fact that the narrator has seen or heard of often very fleetingly strange non-humans. The latter have no interaction with the narrator, so we therefore have accounts of direct experience of perception but no story, or myth where there is a story but few clues to enable a mental visualization of the entities that are evoked. In Michaux text, there is no myth. There are mainly accounts of experience. Sometimes there are some implausible events which are labeled hallucination, visual, auditory, or tactile hallucination. But there are no massive encounters with non-human entities. He writes, mescaline is what is explored. So there is no expectation of an encounter, except with oneself, with one's own functioning and defense mechanism, with what remains when the will has been annihilated. However, Michaux notes presences that are not himself, but these are fortuitous, fleeting, and uncertain. One chapter is entitled Presences That Should Not Be There, and there is a feeling of certainty expressed in infinite turbulence. When he wrote, and somebody quoted that this morning, I saw the millions of gods. Michaux himself expresses doubts of himself and of his readers. Did I really see them? I quote, what did I have to do to believe? Because they were there. People ask me, but was it a vision or hallucination? Could you see them with your eyes open out there or with your eyes closed inside you? It's incredible. I've been so attentive up until now, and all I can say is, I don't remember. But beyond the split, the exploration of mescaline highlights a solitary exploration, and in contrast to the collective dimension of the Amazonian rituals, a feeling of solitude. At best, he split himself into several figures, participant, narrator, observer. Nobody is there to help if there is a problem. Yet, there is one difference between the drawings and the book. No question that the drawings reveals vaguely anthropomorphic shapes or non-anthropomorphic shapes at all, faces. So, let me show you some examples. So this is very abstract, but you could, if you want, interpret the emerging figures in the middle, but you are also encounters with more anthropomorphic figures. This is under LSD. So there is a difference between what Michaux writes and what Michaux draws. The drawings are providing information that are not in his textual description, his textual account. So, who are these characters? Are they still, as Michaux wrote self-portraits? One of his famous quotes is, one is not alone in oneself. On n'est pas seul dans sa peau, in one's skin. Are I quote, draw without anything in particular, scribble mechanically, almost always faces will appear on the paper. As soon as I pick up a pencil or a brush, 10, 15, 20 of them surge up to me on the paper one after the other, and most of them wild. Are all those faces me? Are they other people? From what depth? Couldn't there simply be the consciousness of my own thinking head? So, and it's also interesting to note that there is a difference between drawing with a background, from where the figure can emerge, and drawing with no background at all. No background. No background. And I would say to wrap up that none of the three axes I mentioned, so the myth and accounts of experience, the rituals and the drawing, is sufficient in itself. To be effective in the Unique sculptures, they must remain linked, because for mythology alone would tend today to turn into fiction. It's just stories. Ritual without the mythology and the techniques of mental visualization would turn into folkloric performance. And dissociated from the rest, the graphic knowledge would be reduced to what we call art in the Western world. So it's only by keeping these three axes all together that the cosmology can still be sustainable. In Mishaux' work, we can try to trace a similar link between his text and his drawings, or to put it in another way, between his accounts of experience and his reported visions, his textual account and his graphic accounts. If drugs are to give us a little knowledge, it is by means of their own tools. But if the surface of the drawn sheets is also a meeting place with entities in perpetual transformation, barely emerging from a boiling background or fully formed, then Michaux would be touching on an unexpected knowledge. He wasn't going hunting, he didn't have to coax entities to avoid being a hunter transformed into a prey, nor did he have to know who he was really dealing with behind the appearances. It's not clear whether these forms are himself, as he has written many times, or others who come to haunt him. So as I was saying in the introduction, the primary challenge of Michaux to start was to assess the extent to which art can produce forms of knowledge, can give useful account for science. In this respect, Michaux was proposing a sort of redistribution of the boundaries between poetry and science, since even scientific image is first and above all image, based and structured on conventional protocols. So to achieve this, a series of mediators, transcribers, descriptors needed to be put in place. And it was from then possible to move away from a private language, the domain of the eye, to create public images. And for a long time, Mescaline Drawings became a good way to represent psychedelic visions or visions under altered state of consciousness. By being in the middle of mescaline and peyote, Western science and shamanic rituals, and to go back to what Amadeus was saying, the production of drawings were a proposal, a suggestion to produce a new standard of representation of inner visions, but at the same time, because objectivation is always linked with subjectivation, to propose also a new type of self, which is neither just an I, nor just a he, because as he himself has millions of self, and that's what he keeps drawing all the time. The collective aspect of the rituals are, according to me, inside the drawings. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I think that it's rather late, later than we had in the program, and so in the closing remarks, actually, I had initially thought that that would invite all the speakers here to sort of go over some of the topics of the day and ask what, if anything, had sort of changed your thoughts about other disciplines than yours, especially because this is a field that it's not mine in the sense that it's all rather new for me. But as I said, considering the time would come this afternoon, I will invite you for further conversations next door over drinks, where if you have still questions for the speakers, there's a chance to ask them there. And I will thank everyone really for participating and contributing. It's been terrific, so thank you all.